Alrighty then, we are recording. Hello and welcome to episode 119 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and this is my third cup of coffee so far today. So it may be that by the time we get to the end of this, I'm going to be like vibrating and bouncing up and down and stuff. But such is life. Everything is in a constant state of flux anyway. So, with that as kind of a very brief, inconsequential introduction, I think I'm just going to commence to answering questions because we got quite a few. And so this is probably going to be kind of a longish one. Maybe it won't be 3 hours. We'll see. And the first question is from Elias. And Elias says, is the view that an enlightened being has a crystal clear mind and doesn't think anymore in line with Orthodox Theravada? So the easy answer to that is no. According to Orthodox Theravada, enlightened beings are still thinking, they're still wondering about stuff. You kind of wonder how it is that an enlightened mind would be different from an unenlightened mind other than just no greed, hate, or delusion. But considering that they're thinking about people and this kind of stuff, they're still thinking about samsaric phenomena as though they were real. You'd wonder, why is that not delusion? But the thing is, because we're human, we're still thinking, even though an enlightened being is no longer identified with that thinking and is no longer creating karma. So Orthodox Theravada, especially Abhidhamma philosophy, came up with what is called Kriya Chitta, or functional mind, something like that, which is just a kind of gimmick that allows enlightened beings to still act as though they are creating karma. I mean, they still look like they are performing volitional acts, whereas in reality they are not. Because they're not creating karma. Karma is volition. So I don't think that an enlightened being really does have just a completely thoughtless, clear mind. Probably they still are thinking thoughts, but they're just not identified with those thoughts. It's just nature taking its course. It's just the brain performing its natural function. Just assuming that it is the brain that thinks. Orthodox Theravada philosophy, the commentarial tradition, Abhidhamma and all that, just doesn't know what the brain is for. According to the Visuddhimagga, the brain is just marrow filling a large hollow bone, and that thought actually arises in one of the chambers of the heart. So an enlightened being, if they're like in a state of deep contemplation, might have a crystal clear mind that doesn't think, but when they're standing up and walking around, talking to people, this sort of thing, presumably they're still thinking. It's just that their thought is kind of denatured in a way. You know, it's just has no momentum anymore. It's just like the semblance of thought, or it was always the semblance of thought. It's just that now they just realize it's just a semblance and they're not identified with it. They don't consider it to be real. It's just nature taking its course. So, I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana. And Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana says, if matter exists independently of mind, then wouldn't that mean it is technically an absolute, since it exists without depending on anything else except itself? Well, not necessarily. If matter exists independently of mind, and there's no way of proving that, but hypothetically, if matter exists independently of mind, then still it wouldn't necessarily be an absolute, because the matter could be caused by something else. And also, like, for example, in Orthodox Theravada Buddhist philosophy, matter is ultimately real, but it's like in a constant state of flux. It's appearing and disappearing a trillion times a second. And if you take away the causes of that particular matter also disappears. So it's not like an ultimate reality, except in a very conditional sense. But that is assuming that matter does exist with even if there's no conscious mind perceiving it. And again, there's no way of proving that. So, since it exists without depending on anything else, I mean, obviously, maybe not obviously to everybody, but it's pretty clear to me that any kind of multiplicity requires perception to divide things up, because the divisions are largely arbitrary. You know, you can look at a forest and say that is a forest, or you can single out one clump of trees, or you can single out one tree, or you can single out one branch on one tree, or you can single out one twig on one branch on one tree, or you can single out one leaf on that twig, on that branch, on that tree, or you can single out, I mean, you can just keep singling out like a cell on that leaf, or an organelle contained within that cell, or a molecule contained within that organelle, or whatever. I mean, it's just arbitrary what you're going to consider to be the thing that is being observed. What is the object? What is the unit? And without perception dividing stuff up, you just have this undifferentiated void. So, if matter exists independently of mind, I'm not sure how that would happen. Then wouldn't that mean it is technically an absolute? Not even if we grant that matter does exist without it being perceived by anybody, by any conscious mind, still whether it's an absolute or not is questionable, because it's still conditioned. You know, it's still like a conditional reality. So, since it exists without depending on anything else, and you don't know that, I mean, matter depends on stuff that isn't matter. For example, matter depends on space. You can't have matter without space. So the matter is, in a sense, depending on something other than matter for its existence, etc. And then you've got like all this like theoretical physics stuff about how matter is really just extremely high frequency of electromagnetic radiation. And so matter is energy. E equals mc squared. So maybe Siovaktion Sipad Zina is assuming that just like energy fields and like electromagnetic radiation and so forth would all be put under matter, just as any kind of non-mental entity. I don't know. But I think I've answered that question sufficiently to satisfy myself anyhow. So I'm just going to move on to Siovaktion Sipad Zirina's next question, which is the word samsara actually ever used in the suttas? If so, where and in what context? And yeah, it's found throughout the suttas. It's found throughout the Nikayas. And for example, verse 60 of the Dhammapada, right here. This is probably my favorite translation by I should know this. I just want to make sure I get it right, though. Acharya Buddharakkhita, his translation, which is sold through the Buddhist Publication Society of Sri Lanka. Anyways, it's chapter 5, the chapter of the fool, the Balavaga, the very first verse of the chapter on the fool, which is, long is the night to the sleepless, long is the league to the weary, long is samsara to fools who know not the sublime truth. And the venerable author here translates samsara as worldly existence, and that's generally what samsara means. I mean, literally, it means like faring on, or like transmigration would be arguably a literal translation, or at least close to a literal translation. I think in Chinese, when the Buddhist texts were translated into Chinese, samsara is translated as birth and death. So in a way, it just means like just the journey. I don't like that word much, but the journey through worldly existence. And it's found just throughout the texts. Probably all Nikayas have the word samsara, and it means essentially worldly existence. So, I'm just going to move on to Siovaktion Sipad Zirina's third question, which is, you have talked about AI on this channel, But what are your thoughts on embryonic selection and genetic engineering? There are already companies that can select for IQ and height, and in the future, they will be able to do much more, essentially making a character select screen for your child. What are your thoughts on the future of this, where eventually everyone pretty much does this? Well, it may not be that everyone pretty much does this. It's going to be the people who can afford it. So it's like there's already been a science fiction movie about this called Gattaca, where like the upper classes, like the professional classes, the wealthy and so forth, they can order genetically engineered children. And so like in the movie Gattaca, and this would probably happen, you show interest in a young woman, she's going to be like looking around your cubicle at work, looking for a hair or something, so she can have it taken to a lab and have it genetically analyzed to see if you are one of these genetically perfect superior humans before she's going to really take an interest in you or not. So yeah, I mean, it could result in, like in the movie, a kind of genetically engineered upper class who are, you know, they got super high IQs, perfect health. You know, they're going to be all the astronauts and the good athletes, the professional athletes, the doctors, the geniuses, the talented artists. Almost all of them will belong to this genetically engineered elite. But, I mean, that's eugenics, essentially. I mean, a lot of people consider eugenics to be immoral. I don't know why exactly. It's like eugenics with regard to farm animals or crops, that sort of thing. No problem. They don't see a problem with it, really. At least a few extremists might. But when it gets to human beings, I mean, that's like something the Nazis did. Eugenics, that's just bad. I mean, the Nazis arguably got their ideas from the founder of Planned Parenthood in America. And Planned Parenthood started off as being a kind of eugenics program. Eugenics was kind of a big deal 100 years ago or more. But for some reason, it has gotten a bad rap. Although now that you have the option of having like physically perfect genius children for whatever price you'd have to pay for that, then people are going, that's kind of a good idea. But I think probably you'd be better off with just old-fashioned eugenics rather than like people artificially genetically engineering stuff. I mean, it could be that you could still kind of have a combination of natural eugenics and the artificial, DNA sequencing stuff by just like doing scans on all the eggs and all the sperms, doing some automatic scan and finding the ones, from the donors, the mother and the father that are the most perfect, and just combining those rather than actually getting into the genome and monkeying with that. Because when people do that kind of stuff, they're not omniscient. People are not omniscient. Scientists are not omniscient, and they're going to overlook something. They're going to genetically engineer for something, and it's going to cause some side effect that was unforeseen. So, in my opinion, probably old-fashioned eugenics, where you're just selectively breeding superior specimens to produce superior children, would probably work better. Although that, of course, leaves out most people who are not very well bred. So, let's see here. What is the question exactly? What are your thoughts on the future of this, where eventually everyone pretty much does this? Yeah, I don't think eventually everyone's going to be pretty much doing this. It's going to be the elites that are doing this, the wealthier people. People living in mud huts in the third world are not going to be doing that. So we might be ruled, 100 years from now by a race of genetically engineered Supermen, which is found in a lot of science fiction, and it always, for some reason, turns out to be a bad thing. The Soren Superman, it was even in Star Trek. Khan was one of these genetically engineered superior people, and they just try to take over the world, and then the genetically inferior masses have to rise up in rebellion and cause this catastrophic, cataclysmic world war, which renders the earth uninhabitable or some such. So I guess I've talked enough about that. because really all he asked was, what are my thoughts? And I just spewed out a whole bunch of thoughts. Whole bunch of head thinkings just came out through my mouth. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Wilson. And Wilson says, how do monks who take on the dhutanga of living in a forest feed themselves? I'm guessing they're not hunting wild animals or farming. Do they take supplies with them, rely on visitors, or do they live entirely on gathered flora? None of the above, really. I mean, they could rely on visitors, but the thing is, wherever a monk is living, even if he's living in a forest, he has to live within walking distance of a village. That's the Gochara Gama. That's, his resort, his alms resort. So he's got to be able to live close enough to a village that he can walk there for alms round every morning and then walk back. So that's a few miles, I suppose. And so really it causes the problem if you're living in Burma or probably Thailand, possibly Sri Lanka. I've never been to Sri Lanka. Where if you're within walking distance of a village, you're also within distance of hearing the loudspeaker system blasting cheesy pop music and monks chanting and village announcements and so forth, which is bothersome to Westerners who like peace and quiet, but not bothersome to people in third world countries that don't seem to mind noise. So how do monks who take on the dhutanga of living in a forest feed themselves? They live in a forest that is nevertheless close enough to a village that they can walk to the village and get their daily alms food and then walk back to their tree or their hut or their cave or wherever they're walking back to. I mean, technically, you could have lay people bringing you food. I'm sure a lot of monks who live in forests do that. There's another dhutanga, which is you only eat alms food, in which case, if you're doing that dhutanga also, then you wouldn't be accepting food brought to the monastery. So I guess I answered the question. So I guess I'm just going to move on to Wilson's second question, which is following up on the Pope of Theravada question. So we asked in a previous Q&A whether there is just one reigning supreme Theravada monk who's like the Pope of Theravada, and I pointed out that no, there is not. Each country has like a senior authoritative monk figure, but the Theravada in general does not. So Wilson says, following up on the Pope of Theravada question, and I'm checking to see if we're still recording. Okay, following up on the Pope of Theravada question, I have sometimes seen Catholics criticize Protestants for not having a central authority and saying the result is the bizarre patchwork of doctrines you see in Protestant Christianity. Some are flying rainbow flags, some don't even believe in vaccines or blood transfusions, some are handling live snakes, etc., etc. Given that Theravada Buddhism also lacks a central authority, do they have the same issue? If so, does each division within Theravada consider themselves the true one and everyone else to be heretical, or are they all unified at the end of the day? Well, they're all unified by Dhamma. Like in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the Buddha says that after he dies, Dhamma will be the teacher. And all Theravada Buddhists share the same suttas, they share the same Vinaya, which is the same rules of monastic discipline. So the ultimate authority is the Pali texts. And it's pretty clear cut what the doctrines are. There's like refinement of doctrine in the commentaries. The commentaries are like orthodox, although some schools of Theravada might take the commentaries more or less seriously. They'll put emphasis on this or that. So there's going to be somewhat different interpretations, like the Mahasi tradition of Burma. They'll emphasize what some commentary says, in that you don't even have to have access concentration in order to become a Sotapanna. Just momentary concentration is good enough. You don't have to have jhana. You don't have to cultivate these deep meditative states. Just being mindful, very mindful, is good enough. And that's considered to be unorthodox. And there was a big controversy, like back in the 1950s, especially with Sri Lankan monks saying that's Mahasi method is not correct. And then the Mahasi method saying, no, this is correct because of this here sub-commentary says so. And so, I mean, you might have like disagreements on certain aspects of Theravadan doctrine, but the authority, the final authority for Orthodox Theravada is the Pali Canon. And that includes, all the rules for monks and everything. And so there's not a whole lot of divergence. I mean, all schools of Christianity might consider the New Testament, especially the New Testament, to be, the ultimate authority. But I mean, you look at all these Christian schools, and a lot of them just kind of don't have a whole lot of use for certain teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. The Catholics, I mean, they incorporated a whole lot of ancient pagan stuff as this kind of syncretism to help them take over the pagan mindset and the pagan worldview. They just adopted a lot of classical paganism as a way of just kind of easing themselves into control of the Roman Empire, religion-wise. So, and also the New Testament, it's not a very thick book, whereas the Pali Canon is in the Burmese edition is 40 volumes, so it's a lot more information. And so, yeah, I mean, there's not nearly as much divergence in Theravada as there is in Christianity or Protestant Christianity. Protestant Christianity would be more like Mahayana. Protestantism came after Catholicism, just as Mahayana came after Theravada, or after the earlier schools of Buddhism, which Theravada is the prime example nowadays. So, yeah, it's really not the same kind of situation. Although in the West, you got a lot of divergence. Most of the serious divergence from classical Orthodox Theravada is found in the West, where you've got a lot of like progressives who are just trying to change it to suit themselves. A lot of them just don't like the idea of monks. They're just trying to turn Theravada into a kind of Protestantism, like a kind of Buddhist Protestantism. And they're just essentially fucking it all up. I mean, if you don't like Theravada, follow something else. Don't just change the religion to suit your own unenlightened tastes. So, I'm just going to move on to Wilson's third question before I start ranting. Maybe I got a little bit of ranting in there, but I think we should just move on to the next question. So, Wilson's third question. How can we best help people suffering from Trump derangement syndrome? Some of the meltdowns are kind of amusing, but I think a lot of them are coming from genuine suffering. We all have unskillful thoughts, cravings, and attachments naturally, but I believe these days there are media sources that are deliberately trying to cultivate these states in others for political ends, and they've reached a scientific level of effectiveness. I'm not even talking about dissuading them of their beliefs. I think that's in the realm of normal discussion. I'm talking about helping them to drop the panicking, fear-mongering, and hatefulness. Well, yeah, it is true. Wilson brings up a good point that, I mean, some of the mainstream media, most of the mainstream media to some degree, are actually promulgating this fear-mongering. And they were trying to win an election through fear-mongering. Donald Trump is a Nazi, he's Hitler, he's a fascist, he's a threat to democracy, he's going to declare himself dictator, he said so himself, he's going to put Liz Cheney in front of a firing squad, etc., etc., etc. And they just can't stop now. I mean, to stop now would be like admitting that they were just lying to everybody, gaslighting everybody from the get-go. So that is kind of a problem. I mean, it's like America is divided up into two main camps, sort of like the Roman Empire was divided up into two main camps when Christianity was taking over paganism, like the 4th century. And Christianity was sort of like the progressive movement of ancient Rome. Although I have to admit, Christianity did have a kind of moral high ground that progressivism lacks. Although the progressives do consider themselves to be morally superior to the people they despise, which isn't very moral, but there we are. So anyways, how can we best help people suffering from Trump derangement syndrome? I mean, just talking common sense to them. You know, Trump was already president for 4 years. You know, he didn't become dictator then. It's like, just wait and see. You know, just point out that if they're like repeating, like parroting, like the Liz Cheney in front of a firing squad stuff, I mean, you can just point out to them the actual truth of the matter. And I mean, you may lose friends or whatever. But I mean, there's really not much you can do. You can just avoid political discussion. And then if they keep bringing it up about how Trump is, you know, evil, he's a devil, he's a pedophile, a rapist, and all this, then, I mean, even the rape thing that he's continually accused of, it was this woman just accused him of molesting her in a department store, like 20 or 30 years afterwards. I mean, it's like he runs for president. All of a sudden she remembers this and brings it up. And it was just her word against his. She had no evidence. It was just accusation. And then, of course, a left-leaning judge with a left-leaning jury found him guilty because they're trying to stop him from becoming president. But I mean, at this point, I mean, in ancient Rome, 4th century Rome, you're still a pagan. How are you going to talk sense to a Christian? Like, especially if they're like an evangelist type of Christian, they're just full of zeal. You know, they're just wild-eyed fanatics. And there was a lot of those in ancient times. Lots more than now, at least per capita, like, you know, per 1,000 people. So, I mean, I think just calm common sense. I mean, you don't want to start ranting at them or raging at them because that just hardens their position. You know, you get pushback, you know. So I'm not exactly sure. I think for a lot of them, just the realization that the majority is against them now. I mean, one of the reasons why they're going along with the Trump is Hitler stuff is they're just conforming to what they consider to be the right side of history. And when it becomes more and more clear that their side is losing, then a lot of them are just going to abandon ship. And it's already happening. You've got a lot of Democrats voting Republican for the first time in the recent election. But trying to talk sense, I'm just like trying to talk sense to a Jehovah's Witness. I mean, it's not going to work. So the best way to help people suffering from Trump derangement syndrome, calm common sense, compassion. Don't just fling stuff into their face. Don't rant at them. You know, just remain calm and sympathetic. And I mean, if they keep bringing stuff up, you can either just calmly point out the actual facts of the issue, if you know the actual facts of the issue, or change the subject. Just say, let's not talk about politics. It's pointless. Let's talk about something else. And really, I mean, that's all you can do. You can send metta. That would be a good Buddhist approach. Just beam love at them, even if they disagree with you and think that you're just some ignorant buffoon. So I hope I answered that one because I'm moving on to the next one. And this one is kind of similar. This is from Nirmit. And Nirmit says, what did the Buddha say about politics? And he didn't say a whole lot about politics. I mean, the closest he would say about politics, you know, he'd be talking people out of having wars. You know, it's like he would, there's one sutta in particular where there's like these two factions that were getting ready to fight a war over like property rights over a body of water or something, like a river or some such. You know, that was sort of like their border. And he's just, you know, encouraging them to find a peaceful solution. There's a kind of possibly apocryphal sutta in the Digha Nikaya where the Buddha is saying that crime is caused by poverty and that a good king would subsidize farmers and provide them with, you know, seed grain and like whatever equipment they needed for growing their crops and so forth. But for the most part, the Buddha said that if you're really trying to become enlightened, don't bother with politics. Don't talk about politics. In fact, there's a long list of subjects of conversation that monks should avoid. It's called just animal talk. It's just stuff that is not conducive to enlightenment. It's just samsaric distractions. And that includes talks of kings, talks of ministers, talks of wars, just essentially talking about politics. So, yeah, I mean, Buddhism, early Buddhism was based on, like, from the get-go, step one of being an early Buddhist is you renounce society, which includes renouncing politics. You go out alone into a forest and meditate. So, yeah, I mean, that's mainly the political thing. I mean, people on whatever side of a political spectrum can find passages in the text that appear to endorse their side. But the Buddha he was a centrist. I mean, he taught the middle path. So, yeah, he would discourage any kind of extremism other than the extremism of renouncing society altogether and becoming a wandering recluse. That's kind of extreme nowadays. But in the Buddhist time, in ancient India, that was the middle path. So, yeah, I mean, the less politics, the better for someone who is striving to become enlightened. It's just that if you're living in this world, especially if you're living in like a democratic republic where it's your civic duty to participate in politics to some degree because you're a voter, then, I mean, it is kind of a civic duty to have some kind of knowledge about current events and some kind of theory about politics, following what you think would be best for society so you can vote in favor of that. But if you're like a radical renunciant, you're going for Nibbana in this very life by following the teachings in the texts, then you're not even going to talk about politics. Even if like lay people come to you and want to talk about politics, you just change the subject. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from PSA. And PSA says, is taking Mahayana or Vajrayana ordination inferior to Theravada ordination, or it doesn't matter as long as the practitioner is serious and honest? Well, from a Theravadan point of view, like the Orthodox point of view, certainly Mahayana or Vajrayana ordination would be inferior, because the Orthodox position of any religious system is that religious system is the best one. I mean, why follow a religion if you think there's some better religion that you're not following? Why you just follow the one you think is better? But according to my own opinion, and I'm not really just a dogmatist who follows along with whatever it says in books, especially now that I'm not a monk anymore, then, I mean, it does matter. I mean, it depends on a lot of different things. Like, you can ordain in a Theravada tradition and you're at a sloppy monastery with monks who don't practice and an abbot and like a preceptor who is not a wise person. He doesn't practice. He doesn't follow the rules. You might be better off being ordained at a strict Zen monastery than at a lax Theravada monastery. There's always going to be a certain amount of like unorthodox teachings or just stuff that the Buddha didn't really teach. You're going to find some of that in Theravada. You're going to find even more of it in some Mahayana and like Tibetan schools. So there's that consideration. Mainly if you find a really wise teacher, like someone who's enlightened or close to enlightenment, just really wise, who just has deep insight, who's an effective teacher. I mean, it doesn't really matter all that much what tradition he belongs to. He can be Theravada, he can be a Zen Roshi, he can be some Vajrayana, he can be a Lama, he can be a Sufi, he can be a Christian. I mean, so long as he's like the wisest teacher you have found, the wisest teacher you think you're likely to find anytime in the foreseeable future, you'd do well. I mean, if you just cannot accept Christianity, you don't think Christianity is true, I mean, you should be honest and upfront with this wise Christian teacher and say, I really can't believe the Jesus story. I cannot believe that this Jewish carpenter turned miracle rabbi who lived in the early Roman Empire is the only begotten Son of God and died for my sins and all that. But still, I mean, if he's really wise, he might still be willing to teach you, maybe with the expectation that as he teaches you, maybe you'll gradually see the light and become more of a Christian or some such. So, I mean, there's a lot of things to take into consideration, but I mean, everything else being equal, the wisdom of the teachers and the strictness of the monasteries or the centers, the Dharma centers or whatever, then you're probably better off with Theravada than with some schools of Mahayana especially, or with Vajrayana. I mean, Vajrayana and Mahayana, they do have like profound teachings, like Dzogchen in Tibetan Buddhism. Some of the Zen methods are very advanced. Like Madhyamaka philosophy is very advanced. But then they've got all this other stuff, mythological stuff thrown in, or even just stuff that the Buddha would have denounced if he had heard of it during his lifetime. So, I mean, you really have to like carefully choose based on all these variables. And I think one of the most important variables is just the wisdom of the teacher that you're going to follow. If you're not even following a human teacher, you're just reading books and so forth, you'd probably be better off starting with Theravada because it's older, it goes farther back, it's at least chronologically, it comes closer to the Buddha. You're going to find a higher percentage of genuine teachings of the Buddha in the Pali text than you're going to find in later texts that have already started diverging and going in different directions. You're still going to find wise stuff there. It's just that you're going to have to dig more to find it. So I hope I answered that question. Because I'm moving on to PSA's second question. And it's right here. I watched your video with Brian on Trump winning in a landslide, and around the 48-minute mark, you mentioned the morning after pill. I don't remember mentioning the morning after pill, but maybe Brian mentioned it. Anyways, PSA continues here. I just wanted to mention that this is not a miscarriage pill. The morning after pill prevents the egg from being fertilized by the sperm, so the woman never actually gets pregnant. I'm not advocating for the morning after pill as a birth control method. All I'm saying is that when a woman gets an abortion, a baby dies, but when she takes the morning after pill, nobody dies. It's just a fact. You can do this research on your own. What are your thoughts on this? I'm not sure exactly how long it takes after the man squirts for the spermatozoa to find the ovum in the woman's womb area and like to fertilize the egg. I don't know how many hours that takes on average, whether it's possible for her to take a pill the next day before the zygote has formed, before her egg is fertilized. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I should just follow the advice of PSA and do the research on my own, but I don't think you guys want me to do that right now. So yeah, I mean, from a Buddhist point of view, then to kill or prevent an egg from being fertilized is much better than killing a fertilized, like an embryo at this point. Once the egg is fertilized, it becomes an embryo. A zygote is the first stage of embryonic development. And then from the Buddhist point of view, life begins at conception. A human life begins at conception. So, and people who think that that's just a theory, that's just some weird interpretation, no, that was the belief. It's found in the suttas. It's in the rules of monastic discipline also, that life begins at conception. The rebirth linking consciousness enters the mother's womb at the moment of conception, as soon as that spermatozoon fertilizes that egg. In fact, it can't fertilize the egg unless it's called the Gandhava. It's sort of the karmic momentum of a being who's going to be reborn as that baby is there ready to enter. So, yeah, I mean, the morning after pill, if it really does prevent the fertilization of the egg, it's almost like sort of like celibacy, really. The ovum is celibate. Even if the mother or the woman is not celibate, that ovum remains a virgin in a sense. So yeah, I mean, that would not be nearly as large of a karmic event as actually terminating a pregnancy, even though it's like in the first hours after fertilization, from a Buddhist point of view. From a biological point of view, I think that's kind of an ethical judgment that people should make individually, because from a biological point of view, a fertilized egg doesn't feel anything. It's almost like killing a bacterium in a sense. It doesn't have a nervous system yet. So, yeah, so I mean, I do go along with Buddhism to the extent that you're probably better off not terminating a pregnancy, not having an abortion, inducing a miscarriage, that sort of thing. But I'm not going to insist, because I really don't have a dog in the fight. It doesn't involve me directly. I'm willing to let somebody else decide. And I do think that the best line of action to take with regard to this is have some authoritative body, possibly the Supreme Court, in consultation with medical authorities, just come up with a certain time when a baby becomes a citizen or a human who is worthy of human rights. And I guess nowadays it's just assumed that you're not a human with human rights until you are actually born. And you have to be born naturally. I mean, if a doctor performs an abortion and the fetus comes out alive and viable, in some states that alive, viable fetus that is now a premature infant still doesn't have human rights and can be killed without any murder being committed. So I do think it would be a good idea, probably for the Supreme Court, to just make an official decision on at what point in the development of a baby does it become a human being, a citizen that has rights. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Toronto Nat. And Toronto Nat says, the more I practice Vajrayana, the more convinced I am that Theravada is dull, nihilistic, and lifeless. Am I wrong? If so, how? Well, the texts of Theravada can be rather dull because they're very repetitive, largely because they were composed for oral recitation and memorization. They weren't written down for hundreds of years. At least that's what most people believe. So yeah, the Pali text can be dull, but Theravada itself, you'd have to actually live the lifestyle in order to decide whether it's dull, nihilistic, and lifeless. I mean, to be a layperson just trying to practice Theravada, like, it's sort of like Sandlot Ball. It's, if you're really going to practice Theravada the way it was meant to be practiced, for starters, you renounce the world. And then you're wandering around like through forests. You don't know where you're going to sleep that night. You don't know what you're going to eat the next day. And I mean, that's not exactly dull. I've done that sort of thing. And yeah, I mean, it's like if you're sitting in a chair in a house or sitting in a meditation hall, once a week, then Theravada is, I mean, you're getting like this pale shadow of a fragment of Theravada. And so, yeah, it can seem dull, but if you're really living the lifestyle, I mean, just observing your breath for hours a day, staring at blank walls, that can be dull. I mean, Zen does that to some degree also. So, I mean, to that extent, I mean, if you just need stimulation, you need bright colors and sounds and stuff going on all the time, then yeah, Vajrayana might be better for you. But I mean, if you're really a good meditator, I mean, if you really are cut out to live the life of an ancient Indian Buddhist ascetic, then just watching your breath as it moves in and out of your nostrils for hours a day, it just doesn't get boring. or it doesn't stay boring anyway. I mean, sometimes you can go through these droughts of inspiration and it just seems boring and dumb and dull. But I mean, that is the route to enlightenment. I mean, it is a well-trodden path to enlightenment anyway. With regard to the nihilistic stuff, and with regard to like, sort of, like denying your natural urges, renouncing the world and so forth, it's somewhat nihilistic. It's not nihilistic so much in the philosophical sense as it is in just saying no to what most people say yes to. Just sort of detaching yourself from samsara. That could seem nihilistic, certainly. Lifeless, well, you're not having babies anyway. You're still alive. In fact, you may be more aware of your life processes if you're practicing Theravada Buddhist mindfulness intensively. So it all depends on how you look at it, I suppose. You can say that Theravada is more dull than some much more stimulating system, because that's really not the point of Theravada. The point of Theravada is to cure you of your addiction to samsara. And if your addiction to samsara is requiring you to be stimulated most, if not all of the time, then, I mean, I don't know what to tell you. So, I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Raphael. And Raphael says, in one of your Q&As, you mentioned that out of sheer gratitude, you once prostrated yourself multiple times before a Buddha statue in Burma. What event prompted you to do that again? And I don't know, this might be a rascally question, because yeah, I did do that. And remember, this is in Burma. This wasn't in America. But I was tripping balls on acid at the time. That somebody gave me this vial of liquid LSD, and I figured might as well. So I think it would be the equivalent of like 2 or 3 hits. You know, I don't know how many micrograms that would be. And I was just sitting there meditating throughout most of the night, and just like overflowing with just gratitude and joy and, you know, love for all beings. And I was really bowing to the statue that night. That was in the meditation hall. My cabin, or where I was staying at that time, was a room off the side of the main congregation hall where the big shrine and altar were. So it was a great big imposing Buddha statue that I'm sitting at the foot of. And yeah, and then what happened the next night, I mean, this isn't really answering the question. This is just gratuitous, extra added divergence here. Deviation. What am I trying to say? Digression. That's it. Digression. Is that supposedly there was only like a couple hits left in that vial, just based on what, you know, how much it was supposed to contain. And it turned out that I wound up taking just the most massive dose of LSD I'd ever taken in my life. Then the next night after that, and I pretty much just like liquefied and just melted into the floor that night. Yeah, I wasn't doing much bowing that second night. I was pretty much just horizontal. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly where to go with that. But psychedelics, I mean, especially monks of my generation, at least half of them probably got interested in Dharma through psychedelics, because psychedelics cause like an expanded mental state. And then you start getting interested and you realize that such mental states are even possible, where you're more awake, more conscious than usual, that you're in a state that in some respects is more real than your usual waking state. And then you start looking for natural ways of cultivating that same expanded consciousness without using the chemicals. But somebody gave it to me and I thought, all right, yeah, I'll do this. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to Raphael's next question, which is, you spent most of your time in Burma in solitude. Were there times, however, when you appreciated the company of another monk? And yeah, especially another Western monk, because then we can like cry on each other's shoulders about just the trials and tribulations of living in Burma. So, I mean, just being able to hang out, speak English, you can have deep conversations about philosophy even. Whereas with a Burmese person, first of all, there's the language barrier. I never completely mastered the Burmese language. And even if I did, there's still the culture barrier where most Burmese monks, at least the ones that I knew, all think kind of the same. And so it's rare to have like a really novel, original, stimulating conversation with a Burmese monk after you've had a few conversations with Burmese monks, because you get the same kind of conversation from Burmese monks in general. So being able to hang out with someone who had more of your point of view, some originality, some critical thought and so forth, then just being able to crack jokes, that kind of thing. Yeah, that was refreshing. That was good. That did happen sometimes. So let's see here. I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Liberlam. I guess he's still called Liberlam by some people. They didn't get the memo yet, I guess. So Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Liberlam, says, is the holy life driven by culminating self-restraint such that the more committed one is to fighting their kilesas, the more insight they will attain, middle way considered? So this is almost completely understandable. So Stellar Supreme is his complicated cerebral questions. This one is pretty accessible as his complicated cerebral questions go. So is the holy life driven by culminating self-restraint such that the more committed one is to fighting their kilesas, the more insight they will attain, middle way considered? Well, I mean, if you're committed to fighting your kilesas, then you're pretty much doomed to failure, unless you get to a certain stage when you realize that Khmer Rouge tactics against your own defilements is not going to work. You're just creating more karma with the struggle. So, I mean, the more progress you make, the more effortless it becomes, with certain exceptions that can occur along the way. But just being committed to fighting your kilesas, that can be like a fanatical point of view that is as much of a hindrance as a help. But at the end here, he's got sort of the mitigating factor of middle way considered. But still, there's no guarantees. It's not just a matter of like determination to fight your kilesas. I mean, you're going to have a certain amount of parami, a certain amount of spiritual talent. It's sort of like someone who wants to be a great artist, that just their commitment to striving to be a great artist isn't necessarily going to help them become a great artist if they just lack talent to begin with. And I'm thinking of, what was her name? Fanny Price in of Human Bondage, my Somerset mom. She was like this fanatical art student, just determined she was going to be this great artist. She just had to fight to just learn everything she needed to learn. And the problem was she was just devoid of talent. She just was a hopeless case. So let's see here. Let's just read the question again, shall we? Is the holy life driven by culminating self-restraint such that the more committed one is to fighting their kilesas, the more insight they will attain, middle way considered? Not necessarily. I mean, it could be that you're not really committed to fighting your kilesas. You're just drawn to meditation or something. You just enjoy it. You're good at it. And it just progresses from there. It could be like a joyful thing and not really a struggle thing. But it depends. There's different temperaments, different characters, and different people are going to make progress in different ways. But cultivating self-restraint, maybe that's what he meant instead of culminating self-restraint. Cultivating self-restraint. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely an important aspect of it. Even if you're like taking some kind of esoteric tantric route or something, there's still going to be some self-restraint involved. So, Yeah. So self-restraint, I mean, it is like essential. You know, it's a vital part of spiritual practice. But the commitment to fighting your kilesas, I don't think that really is necessarily vital, and it can be more of do more harm than good. And eventually you're going to have to let go of that. You never let go of the self-restraint necessarily, but a commitment or determination to overcome your kilesas. To some degree, it's like goal-oriented Dhamma, which is always playing with fire, because things never turn out exactly the way you expect them to. Things just go in a different direction, and then you can become disillusioned and discouraged and everything, because you have this ideal that you're setting up, which may not have been a realistic ideal to begin with. Which is one reason why J. Krishnamurti was always warning against having ideals. You know, it just makes a person like hypocritical to some degree. So the holy life, driven by, I assume he means cultivating instead of culminating, self-restraint, such that the more committed one is to fighting their kilesas. It may be that you're not having a conscious commitment. It can just be like a drive or a sense of duty or something. That would be better than just having this determination of slaying your defilements. And kilesas is usually translated as defilement. So I'm not sure if I answered that one, but let's move on to Liberlam. Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Liberlam, second question. It is as follows. In the Great Discourse on Causation, it gives this outline of the dimensions. Then there is the dimension of non-percipient beings, and secondly, the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception. That's unquote. Do you see this as implying that beings don't inhabit beyond 8th jhana, or just at the base of it, or what? Before this, it notes beings inhabiting jhanas 1 through 7. Well, according to the orthodox interpretation of the Buddhist cosmos and the 31 planes of existence, when you get above the Deva Loka, when you get up into the Rupa Loka, or the realm of form, and the Arupa Loka, or the formless realms, each one of those realms corresponds to a level of jhana. So there used to be originally 4 stages of jhana, four levels of meditation, essentially. And then 4 more were added subsequently that were kind of an annex to 4th jhana, so that you can still say there's the 4 jhanas, but then you've got the 4 formless jhanas that are added onto that. And the 2 highest ones are the realm of nothingness and the realm of neither perception nor non-perception. And that's what's being mentioned here in this quote. Then there is the dimension of non-percipient beings, and secondly, the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception. And this level of, the formless jhana of neither perception nor non-perception is the highest jhanic state you can reach. And that also corresponds to the highest heaven realm in the entire Buddhist cosmos, the realm of neither perception nor non-perception, where mind is so subtle, you can't really tell if it's there or not. So, do I see this as implying that beings don't inhabit beyond 8th jhana, or just at the base of it, or what? Yeah, that is the highest realm in the Buddhist cosmos that any being can exist in, can be born into, is the realm of neither perception nor non-perception, which corresponds to the highest formless jhana state. So yeah, that would be the highest you can go in samsara. And I hope I answered that question. And I'm moving on to the next question, which is from Zenithoid. And Zenithoid said, can you give your opinion on this video? And he sent a link to a video by, what's his name? Redeemed Zoomer or something like that. Yeah, Redeemed Zoomer on YouTube. Did this little video where he's talking about how the Jedi in the Star Wars saga come close to Buddhism, whereas the evil Sith, all these Darths, that they actually come closer to Christianity, even though this Redeemed Zoomer is himself apparently a Protestant Christian. So Xenothoid says, as a kind of commentary, I think it's true that Star Wars is definitely more dharmic than Abrahamic. The only thing that strikes me as deeply Christian is that Anakin is an obvious analog to Christ. So that's Darth Vader, or at least Darth Vader before he became Darth Vader. He was like the Darth Vader kind of bodhisattva or something. So anyways, see, the only thing that strikes me as deeply Christian is that Anakin is an obvious analog to Christ. I wonder how much George Lucas was praising and critiquing Jesus through Anakin, because on the one hand, he ultimately does fulfill his role as the chosen one and save the galaxy, while on the other, he is extremely far from perfect. Luke seems like a more positive portrayal of a Christ figure, because in the pre-Disney continuation of Star Wars, Luke encourages his new Jedi Order to not avoid attachment, romantic or otherwise, which is more Christian than Buddhist. I think the thing redeemed Zoomer missed is that the Sith seem more Nietzschean than anything else. And I should say, as a kind of disclaimer, that I really was not heavily into the sequels. Like the second Star Wars movie with the Ewoks and all that, it turned me off big time. I thought the Ewoks were cringe, and then it didn't really end. You know, it was just setting up for the next step in the sequel. And so I was very unimpressed by The Empire Strikes Back. And then Return of the Jedi, I remember almost none of it. I've seen each of those movies just once. I think I saw the original Star Wars 2 or 3 times. Every movie after that, you know, up through I think it was like the 6th one I saw once. And then when it started getting into the politically correct Disney stuff, you know, with the message kind of hijacking the actual story, that I just lost interest and didn't watch any of those. So I really am not well versed in the whole iconography of Star Wars. So it is true that this redeemed Zoomer was kind of wallowing in samsara and thinking that, you know, it's wiser and better because he's a Protestant Christian, apparently, that you should, you know, that wallowing in samsara in a certain way is good, detachment is bad, and he's enslaved to a kind of worldly, you know, kind of reformed Jewish worldview. And he was saying that like contemplation is a Buddhist thing, and Christianity doesn't really endorse like getting into like a formless state where you're not thinking about anything. And so he was apparently unaware of the contemplation practiced in like contemplative monastic orders in Roman Catholicism and also in like Greek Orthodoxy, Greek and Roman or Russian Orthodoxy. So also, he was apparently unaware of the general epistle of James that I mentioned relatively recently in these Q&As, where James essentially has like a dharmic point of view with regard to the cause of all suffering is desires. Whereas redeemed Zoomer is saying, you know, some desires are good, and that you should hate evil and not be detached. You know, you should still be kind of in samsara, functioning within the context of samsara, even ideally. You know, it's like love good, hate evil, and you should have passion towards fixing the world and making it better and this kind of thing. So, let's see. Let's just scroll up here in Xenothoid's question. Can I give my opinion on the video? I think a lot of these resemblances of, you know, the Jedi being kind of based on Buddhism and the Sith being more or less based on Christianity and all that, it's just coincidental to some degree. That I think the Star Wars story, especially like the first few episodes, first few installments of the series, would be more along the lines of, what's the hero with 1,000 faces? I can't remember the guy who wrote The Hero with 1,000 Faces. It's just like the standard, what do you call it? Just, it's like a universal kind of theme, like an archetypal story where you've got the innocent youth, who is destined to become a hero. It's in a way, it's like his innocence makes him somehow worthy of performing these, extreme feats, like the Grail story. It has to be Sir Percival the Pure, who had never lain with a woman, was the only one worthy of finding the Grail, this kind of stuff. So I think it's not so much intended by George Lucas to be Buddhism versus Christianity as, it's just like this archetypal story that you can interpret that way, but you can interpret other ways also. But then again, it is true, I've mentioned this before, that Yoda is based on a Buddhist monk. That Yoda was based on the Cambodian Sangha Raja who was living in Stockton, California. George Lucas came from a city just a little bit south of Stockton. I can't remember its name. And let's see. No, forget it. I'm not going to try and remember the name of the town that George Lucas came from. But he apparently was familiar with this Cambodian Sangha Raja who was living in exile in California, not living in Cambodia because the government was anti-religion in those days. So he sent people with cameras and recorders and followed around this 100-year-old Cambodian monk, and they based Yoda, like his speech mannerisms and so forth, on the way this old Cambodian monk was talking. And even the word Yoda, the name Yoda, literally means warrior in the Pali language, presumably in Sanskrit also. So, I mean, there was some obvious deliberate Buddhism that was included in the whole Jedi philosophy and everything. So it could be that George Lucas deliberately liked Buddhism and tried to model the spiritual philosophy of the Jedi to some degree, at least, on Buddhism. Maybe he was down on Christianity, maybe he had a strict Christian upbringing and rebelled against it or something and tried to make the Sith more Christian. But then again, I think was George Lucas still running the show when the Sith came out and all that? I don't remember. I don't remember that. So yeah, I do think that a lot of the similarities are just sort of coincidental. But it is true that Yoda is based on a Buddhist monk, so there is that. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. That's what I'm going to do. This is also from Xenothoid. And Xenothoid says, if our reality is created by our perceptions, does this mean that fictional stories have their own reality unto themselves as long as someone is perceiving them? As in, as long as there are people watching Star Wars, is there a real Anakin Skywalker who saved a galaxy a long time ago, far, far away? And I think probably in Orthodox Theravada, the answer would be no. Although I did read, I think the book was Seth Speaks by Jane Roberts, who is channeling this multi-dimensional entity who calls itself Seth back in the 1970s. And Seth was saying that one reason why no matter how many beings become enlightened, there's always more beings. There's always going to be an infinite number of beings in this universe because the universe is like spawning new beings. And he gave two ways in which it happens. I mean, it might be more than two ways. And this is just completely unorthodox. This is heresy from a Theravada Buddhist point of view. But it's intriguing. I think it is interesting that one way is that the karmic stream of a being can split. So you've got like this karmic stream of a human being or a low-ranking deva or something, and they just kind of send off this little offshoot that then just becomes a dog or something. And then that just starts its own evolution. It's like a new being that just split off, sort of like asexual reproduction through budding. In some beings, some relatively primitive animals reproduce this way. Like a hydra, the freshwater hydra reproduces this way, just through budding. It just splits off little copies of itself. And then another way is through like imagination or dreams, where you dream some being It's a being that you've never met before. And this happens all the time. You dream about somebody, you have this, you're interacting with this person in this dream, and it's someone you never met before. It's someone you don't know. It's just your imagination kind of created this person. And according to Seth, that these beings that you're generating in your imagination, your daydreams, your night dreams, it's sort of, you're creating beings that start off this very subtle, shadowy kind of existence, and then that's starting off this whole new evolution of a karmic stream for a being. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. It's just kind of an intriguing idea. But it does seem like I think about my father sometimes. He died many years ago, but in a way, it's like you're perpetuating a kind of existence of this person that you keep remembering and thinking about, and this just sort of, it creates this vibe of them or something. Or like reading War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Pierre Bezahov. So many people read about Pierre Bezahov that in a sense he could become what pagans call an egregore. It's like an actual being who exists because so many other beings are contributing their consciousness to believing in this, that it actually like creates an actual being that exists. And again, this is just vile heresy, pernicious wrong view from a Theravada Buddhist point of view, but it is an intriguing idea. So let's just try and get back to the question here. If our reality is created by our perceptions, does this mean that fictional stories have their own reality unto themselves as long as someone is perceiving them? In a sense, yeah. I mean, it would be way more tenuous, shadowy, flimsy, ephemeral kind of an existence than this. But I mean, even this world that we consider to be so real is also fiction in a sense. We're in the matrix in a sense. It is an illusion. It's Maya. And so you've got a way more attenuated, more crude, less developed versions of that, when we're reading a novel that, is sort of creating these beings, it's kind of giving life to them, especially if it's a good novelist who is good at like personification. What's the word? Character development, that kind of thing. He makes a realistic, multi-dimensional character. Then in a way, you could say that so long as somebody is perceiving that character, they do have a kind of existence. Just as I'm perceiving this cup, which is giving this cup a kind of existence. And my coffee is cold now. So I just want to try and do justice to this question. It is an interesting question. If our reality is created by our perceptions, does this mean that fictional stories have their own reality unto themselves as long as someone is perceiving them? As long as there are people watching Star Wars, is there a real Anakin Skywalker who saved a galaxy a long time ago, far, far away? Well, I mean, this cup isn't real. So, I mean, you can say that it's a real cup. I mean, it holds the coffee in. So, I mean, it's a kind of conventional reality. So long as people believe that something is true, that adds a kind of conventional truth to it. So, I mean, when you're reading a story, a part of you is believing that it's real. It's like when you're watching a scary movie. I mean, I can detach from movies more than most people. Whereas, you get to like the scary part and it's like, the special effects are good in this, I'm still thinking of it as a movie instead of just getting immersed into the story. But I mean, you're creating little universes whenever you're doing that. It's like you're playing a video game. I mean, that's your world, is this video game that you're playing. And I mean, it's no more fake ultimately than this world, which is also a kind of illusion. So it could be one's philosophical point of view or attitude is going to determine the exact answer to this question. So, yeah, there's not a real Anakin Skywalker any more than there's a real George Lucas. So, I mean, it's just a matter of levels of like pseudo reality. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, if I am correct, in Buddhism there is no right or wrong, only skillful or unskillful, and one's mental state is the sole determining factor as to whether an action is good or bad. You often use the analogy of the snake and the frog to illustrate this. I am wondering if you can clarify this concept as it pertains to the uncomfortable topic of pedophilia. I don't even know if you're even allowed to say that word on YouTube. Just call it the P word, I guess. There is a movement afoot to legitimize mutually consensual relationships between adults and children. Not only do these P word activists sincerely believe that they are not doing anything wrong by having sex with underage children, they actually believe they are doing good! ! They consider laws against adult-child relationships as prejudice and oppression. I know this is hard to believe, but if you are skeptical, check out the NAMBLA website. How would the Buddhists no right or wrong when it comes to physical actions without bad mental states apply here? After all, however warped we may feel about their behavior and mental states, these P words themselves feel perfectly fine with them, and these people actually not generating bad karma for themselves? Well, let me take a more extreme example of someone who thinks that they're doing the right thing, but really, from a Buddhist point of view, they're making very bad karma. And that would be like an Islamic terrorist. You know, someone who blows up a building that's got women and children, like unarmed civilians in there, who never did them any wrong. And they think they're going to go to heaven because of this. They think they're doing something good. Or, I mean, a much milder situation would be someone who hunts or fishes for relaxation. You know, it's just a wholesome kind of hobby. You know, they just sit on the riverbank and catch fish and, you know, haul them up on the bank and bash their head in, and then they take them home and cook them for dinner. And it's just wholesome, all good, clean fun. So, I mean, it's just because you can justify something or just because you believe that what you're doing is good doesn't mean that from a Buddhist point of view, it really is good. For example, in Buddhism, any kind of like sexuality, wallowing in sensuality of any sort, even like food or music, anything like that, alcohol, intoxicants, whatever it is, dancing, that wallowing in this is already, you're making bad karma for yourself to some degree. And I mean, there's a whole scale. I mean, it doesn't mean you're going to burn in hell because you went dancing, but still, or because you had sex with your spouse or something, but still, just because you enjoy something doesn't mean that you're not making bad karma, because there are underlying mental states like lust, for example. And with regard to like having sex with a child, I mean, deep down, you know that there's something like deviant about it. They've got like deviant reasons, you know, sort of like unhealthy reasons for why they're attracted to small children in the first place. You know, they're afraid of grown-up women, or it's just like the complete helplessness and trust of a small child makes them feel like they're more at ease and in control of the situation or some such. But just because you can justify something does not mean that you're doing something right. So, and then the children, as a general rule, it messes them up. Even if, you know, they go along with it at the time, later on, you know, they can have relatively severe psychological issues because of what happened to them as a child. That happens a lot. So let's see, what is exactly the question here? How would the Buddhist know right or wrong when it comes to physical actions without bad mental states apply here? Yeah, I mean, just the lust for starters. And I mean, as a general rule, there's some sort of deviance involved, some kind of unhealthiness involved, even in being attracted to a child, even though the P words can justify it and say, you know, they're just as healthy as anyone else, just as a morbidly obese person can say they're just as healthy as anyone else, or whatever it is. You know, anyone can justify their position, no matter how deviant or unhealthy it is. So I'm not exactly sure what, like, the underlying like unskillful mental states would in all probability be involved in someone who is sexually attracted to a toddler, for example. I mean, there is a difference between being sexually attracted to a 16-year-old girl who is biologically, at least, an adult. You know, she is biologically sexually mature. And then on the other hand, someone who is like sexually attracted to a 5-year-old. I mean, it seems to me that there would be some sort of deviance, especially in the latter case. The first case, that was just standard throughout the human race for thousands of years. You know, lately that has become considered very bad, and especially if it's someone on the other side that you need a good reason for attacking them, you can bring that up. But, you know, like Matt Gaetz, you know, he supposedly, allegedly had a relationship with a 17-year-old girl. And I mean, even 50 years ago or 100 years ago, it would be just kind of a non-issue unless he was married and was like committing adultery or something. Not that I'm trying to justify anything necessarily. I'm just pointing out that some of this is like cultural, you know, it's based on culture, but I don't think there's been a very, very rare that there's ever been a culture that would approve of an adult man having sex with a toddler. You know, that is unnatural. You know, there's just something built into us that sees that as reprehensible and deviant. And even the people who do it are probably still going to have that instinctive taboo, like, repressed in their subconscious mind, so that it's still there, even though they're like, you know, maybe subconsciously like repressing that because they don't want to feel that or something. So I guess I've babbled enough about that. So I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Quesitor. And he says, is Nibbana experienced at each of the 4 stages of enlightenment? And there was somebody else who, not under a Q&A, but I think it was under a different video that I uploaded, was asking me, or he was talking about, is Nibbana experienced? And technically, you would have to say that Nibbana is not experienced, that you don't really perceive Nibbana, at least from an orthodox Theravada point of view. That you can't perceive Nibbana. And if there's no perception, there's no real experience from an orthodox Theravada Buddhist point of view. But just set aside the word experienced. So Quesitor says, is Nibbana experienced at each of the 4 stages of enlightenment? And according to orthodox Theravada, you get a glimpse of Nibbana at each of the attainment of each of the 4 stages. So when you become a Sotapanna, you get this glimpse of Nibbana that lasts a trillionth of a second. And then you kind of go into a coma a little bit after that. And then somehow you, even though you didn't experience it, you still are aware of having somehow kind of experienced it. And I really think that the whole idea of the 4 stages of enlightenment is not what the Buddha originally taught. That like in G.C. Pandey's Studies in the Origins of Buddhism, he gives reasons for why he is skeptical of the whole 4 stages of enlightenment. That Sotapanna probably just meant like a born-again Christian, just like you've entered upon the path of Dhamma, and you know you're very idealistic and enthusiastic and so forth, and that's probably what it originally meant. But then it became a superhuman mental state. You know, it was like one of the stages of enlightenment from, I mean, later on. The next stage is Sakadagami, which isn't even mentioned in the oldest texts. Like, I think in the Samanyapala Sutta, which is in the Digha Nikaya, it's one of the cardinal texts in Theravada Buddhism, where King Ajatasattu comes to speak with the Buddha, and the Buddha is giving Ajatasattu a discourse on the advantages or the benefits of practicing Dhamma, and he gives them in ascending order. And I'm pretty sure he doesn't even mention the 4 stages of sainthood. That probably the idea of the 4 stages of enlightenment or Aryahood or sainthood is subsequent to the composition of the Samanyapala Sutta, if I remember correctly, that the 4 stages are not mentioned in that text. So, I mean, it's all kind of academic. If the 4 stages of enlightenment are just a kind of apocryphal teaching that the Buddha didn't endorse, and that it's like a misinterpretation or distortion of earlier teachings, then, I mean, according to the text, there is like a flash of Nibbana that lasts like a trillionth of a second at the attainment of each of these 4 stages. But I'm not even sure that Nibbana even works that way. That, you know, like you get this flash that lasts a trillionth of a second, and then you kind of go into a coma afterwards, and then you snap out of it, and somehow you're aware, even though you didn't technically experience it, that you somehow kind of almost sort of experienced it. It's some aspects of Orthodox Theravada do not stand up to scrutiny very well. And so it relies on dogmatism, or people just not really wanting to apply critical thought, or not being able to, they're not like philosophically sophisticated enough to see the flaws in an argument, kind of a thing. But according to Orthodox tradition, at each of these 4 stages, there is going to be a flash of Nibbana. So, but I do think it's just kind of an academic question, like a hypothetical kind of a question, because I do not think that the 4 stages of enlightenment were really taught by the Buddha. I think it's a distortion of earlier teachings, and it's just, I don't really care about it. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from the person whose name is spelled like it should be pronounced Kriel, but is actually pronounced Throat Warbler Mangrove. And Throat Warbler Mangrove says, do you think that the end of suffering and the end of rebirth are one and the same? And again, according to Orthodox tradition, yes. The end of suffering and the end of rebirth are one and the same. That when you end suffering, you don't create any more karma. And like at the moment of death, what karma you had as latent, like residual karma, just evaporates somehow. And so there's no more like rebirth linking consciousness. There's no more psychic momentum that causes you to be reborn. So in a way, the end of rebirth is kind of a side effect of the end of delusion. Or you could say that the end of rebirth is a side effect of the end of suffering, which is itself a side effect of the end of delusion. But like I was mentioning, I think it was the previous Q&A or the Q&A before that, I think it is kind of, it's plausible, I guess, that an enlightened being could continue to appear to take rebirth, even though there's not going to be anybody there. Ultimately, there never was anybody there. There's nobody here. There's nobody anywhere. But it's just sort of like this kind of an empty being who is sort of like an egregore, like I was mentioning earlier, where he's just like a production of other people's karma. Something like that, I think, is possible. And some Thai monks apparently believe that that's possible, because in what's his name, Ajahn Mun, who's considered to be, he's like the greatest monk of modern Thailand. That he was sort of he was practically the founder of the Thai forest tradition. He was considered to be an arahant, and according to his biography, written by one of his disciples, who was also considered to be an arahant, he had Buddhas and whole retinues of thousands of dead arahants, dead Buddhas, all coming to visit him. So, I mean, that's unorthodox, but at least some highly respected, revered Thai monks, anyway, believe that it's possible. Whether it's rebirth or not, or just some sort of, pseudo rebirth, some kind of karma conditioned manifestation, maybe. But yeah, I mean, it's in a way, we're getting into hypotheticals again. But officially, according to Orthodox Theravada Buddhism, the end of suffering and the end of rebirth are one and the same. So I move on to Throat Warbler Mangrove's follow-up question. If so, how did the Buddha know that he will not suffer any more rebirths? And how can we say how the Buddha knows anything? I mean, we're second guessing a fully enlightened Sammasam Buddha. How did he know? Who knows? I don't know how the Buddha knew this. But presumably, he was like infinitely wise because he had zero delusion. And so he'd probably just see clearly the state of affairs and just announce the clearly seen state of affairs. He just knew that his karma was neutralized, deactivated. And so, but all we can do is just second guess a fully enlightened being, which is kind of silly, I guess. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. And this is from the Virgin Mary J, whose real name is Cherzaskaziz. And Virgin Mary J, whose real name is Cherzaskaziz, says some monks said that somewhere in the suttas there are stories of the Buddha when his back was hurting and when he was in pain. Sometimes he would stop a Dhamma talk and ask someone else to finish this Dhamma talk instead of him, and he himself lay down. Is it true? Well, there are suttas where the Buddha would want to stretch his back, and it may just be a kind of a manner of speech in ancient India. So you're just getting tired of sitting up all the time. You're getting uncomfortable. It's not necessarily that you've got a backache, that your back is hurting. It's just like, I need to stretch my back and lie down. It's just getting tired of sitting up all day long or something. And so, yeah, there were times when he would lie down. I think there's a few times when he'd be giving a talk and then, it's like, I need to stretch my back. I'm going to lie down. Let somebody else continue. That's possible. I mean, it is in the text that he did do that. I don't know for sure that he was literally in pain. It may be just, it was getting late. He figured it was time for him to lay down, and he just let one of his chief disciples continue with the discourse because he wanted to stretch his back, kind of a thing. So, yeah, so it does say that in the text. So I'm just going to move on to Cherzaskaz's second question here, which is, what do you think it means, darkness within darkness, which is like metaphorical talk of Christian mystics, darkness within darkness. And I assume darkness is just a lack of perceptual content, like emptiness in Buddhism. And darkness within darkness is that you don't even have the concept of emptiness or darkness. It's just even beyond that. Sort of like there's the text, the Kalahavivada Sutta, which is talking about how the advanced saint, presumably the enlightened being, he has no perception of perception. He has no perception of non-perception. And so darkness within darkness, it'd be, you don't even have the perception of non-perception. That's how I would interpret it. It's like darkness, it's sort of like Nirguna Brahman in Hinduism, where it's just ultimate reality, which has no discernible characteristics. It's like a characterless mystical state But even to call it darkness is going too far, because even that doesn't really apply. It's just sort of a symbol that is invalid ultimately. And so you just darkness within darkness, which is kind of separating you like one step from the first symbol, and just you take an infinite regress of darkness within darkness within darkness, just forever, I guess, to really completely distance yourself from just this concept of darkness, which doesn't really work, but you have to say something. So it's just like non-perception of non-perception, sort of. But it goes beyond words, which is why they have to say darkness within darkness, because they can't say what it really means. And so I can't say what it really means either. So I'm just going to move on to Virgin Mary J, alias Trzaskis, is his third question here. How about live stream Q&A on Black Sunday, December 1st? Why is it called Black Sunday? Is that like a European thing? I don't know. I know there's like Black Friday, which is the day after Thanksgiving. And in Europe, I don't think they have Thanksgiving the way Americans have Thanksgiving. I mean, it's possible. It's theoretically possible I could do a live Q&A on December 1st, which is a few weeks from now, I guess. So, yeah, I'm not going to promise, but yeah, it is possible. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Skoladin or Skuladin. And the question is, how contagious are mental states? And then he's got the bullet point commentary. There seems to be quite a few people seething that weren't about a week ago for whatever reason. They seem to have an unhinged view of the world, like Freud, who thought his patients were a 1-1 representation of the average person, maximum cherry picking. So how contagious are mental states? It depends on, like, if you're like a very open, empathetic person and don't have much wisdom, then they could be very contagious. On the other hand, if you're kind of a reserved, kind of aloof sort of person and you've got wisdom, then you've got more resistance. You might still feel it in the air. You know, there's a pissed off person in the room. You can feel that, but it's going to be less likely to get you as agitated as if you were a very empathetic and at the same time sort of a foolish sort of person. So it would be largely a matter of two factors. It's just wisdom versus unwisdom, and also like how connected are you with the mental states of other people. But we're all connected to some degree. And I mean, even a sociopath probably has some kind of connection, even if it's subconscious and they're not fully aware of it. I mean, even for most people, most of the connection we have with one mind and another mind is subconscious. It's not a matter of conscious thinking ego. So yeah, there's how contagious are mental states? Contagious enough that you have to be careful about it, but it's going to vary from person to person, but it's always going to be there. There's a certain amount of contagion in mental states, which is why in the Mangala Sutta, the list of blessings in a person's life, blessing number 1 is not associating with fools. Because you associate with fools and their mental states are contagious, and you catch a dose of foolishness from them. And then the second blessing is associating with the wise, because wise people's mental states are also contagious. So if you're in the presence of a very wise person, that uplifts you. I mean, it sort of refines the consciousness, the vibe of the area. You know, the center of gravity of consciousness is raised by having a wise person there. So, yeah, I think I answered that one about as well as I'm able to. So I'm just going to move on to Skoladin's second question. Is there an optimal method to jettison thought pollution? And then the bullet point says, I noticed that after spending some time with a negative, unwise person, that negative, unwise perceptions arose that were analogous to me for about a week or so. It was odd because I didn't even converse with them. It was like you could just pick up negative, irrational perceptions just through osmosis, or just through like a perception of that person, and then that kind of triggers latent tendencies in yourself. I mean, if they're not even nearby anymore, then the contagion part is already finished, and it's just sort of, it could have like planted a seed, or what is more likely, it just sort of activated this latent tendency in yourself. So getting back to the real question, the actual question, is there an optimal method to jettison thought pollution? Mindfulness is the panacea. Just let the thought arise and note it and let it go. So you have to have mindfulness as a kind of habit already. It's just something that you have to practice in life, so that when situations like this happen, then you've got a kind of defense against them. So a foolish thought arises, you just, thought arising, and then you just note it and let it go. That's the optimal method to jettison thought pollution. And prevention is a good way. I mean, that's not jettisoning it, but preventing the thought pollution by just not associating with foolish people, if at all possible. So I'm just going to move on to Skoladine's third question. And I really don't know the correct way of pronouncing his name. I guess it would be Skoladin. Anyways, he says, would I generate bad karma for causing or forcing an ego death? And then the bullet point says, like if theoretically somebody named Bag of Bones, B-O-B for short, went online and commented like a good Samaritan, but then this comment was read by a mentally ill person who tried to mislabel it as problematic ism phobe arises, thereby trying to detach from the moment, because it not only challenged their worldview, it completely BTFO'd them, as they believed their mental illness was their true self. Well, if you've got good intentions in what you say, you're just telling the truth. You think people ought to know the truth, and you're not saying it for the sake of punishing anybody, making anyone feel bad or whatever. You're just saying something that you think is just an objective fact that ought to be said, and you're not saying it as a weapon, not deliberately for the sake of bothering anybody necessarily. Then you haven't done anything wrong. Somebody else can. It's like someone who makes a kitchen knife is not guilty if somebody uses that kitchen knife to stab somebody else. It depends on your own mental states. The karmic or ethical quality of an action depends on the intentions and volitions of the person who commits, or who does the deed. So, would you generate bad karma for causing or forcing an ego death? Only if you did it intentionally. Or, if there's a certain amount of carelessness or delusion involved, and there's always a certain amount of delusion involved, then indirectly it might cause some problems. But as a general rule, the ethical quality of your actions or your words depend on your own intentions. And if somebody decides to get offended by that, even though, like microaggressions are a good example. So you meet like someone who's obviously not from your country, you ask them where they come from, that's a microaggression. And then if they're like a progressive leftist, they might get offended simply because they've been told that it's offensive. It's a microaggression. They've just been microaggressed. But if it's done in good faith, you're just being friendly. And then you might even commit another microaggression by telling them they speak English very well. That sort of thing. That's a microaggression too. People can be offended by that. But if you're not meaning any offense at all, you're just trying to be friendly, then yeah, it's on them. It's their own fault if they get offended. And that's one thing that's always true regardless, is being offended is always your own fault. Whoever is offended, that's their doing. So, you could go up to a saint and just chew them out, call them every name you can think of. And if they're really wise, they won't be offended. They'll just forgive you. But if they get offended, that's their doing. I mean, for you to be chewing them out is your doing. For you to be trying to offend them is your doing. But if they actually are offended, that's their doing. And that's like a relatively elementary level of Buddhist ethics that Western lay Buddhists just don't like that part. And so they just ignore it or reject it. A lot of them. Because, of course, the doctrine of progressive leftism is, I mean, you're not supposed to offend anybody. And if you do, that's your fault. But really, if you offend somebody by accident, you're not even trying to offend them, then if they get offended, that's entirely their fault. It's their own doing. So I think that may answer the question. And if it doesn't, that's too bad, because I'm moving on to the next one, and that's from Lucky Luciano. And Lucky Luciano says, I have a question. How do you feel about the concept of the Tao and the way Taoist traditions believe it's necessary to gain a type of enlightenment, but it isn't part of Buddhism? Well, the Tao, yeah, it's just a different approach to essentially the same situation. That Zen Buddhism incorporated quite a bit of Taoism into it when it moved into China. But I mean, the Tao itself is really a kind of poetic way of describing the absolute. It's like from the Tao came the one, from the one came the two, from the two came the 10,000 things. It's just the Tao is just sort of the underlying harmony, or probably better yet, the source, the underlying source of the underlying harmony. It's just sort of the ultimate, the absolute. And it's spoken of a lot in a poetic manner that really was not the approach taken by ancient Indian ascetics that were equally spiritual, but it's just largely a cultural thing. Like the Chinese, I've read that the Chinese mind, at least back in those days, was much more poetical and intuitive. The Chinese language is more kind of poetical and intuitive than like ancient Indian languages, like Northern Indian, like Indic languages. So just the way of thinking resulted in a different emphasis, whereas in Buddhism, the ultimate just is not reified. You just don't talk about it much. It's just off the scale. Whereas most traditions that aren't like Buddhist will reify the absolute. And generally in the West, they call it God. But in the East, they call it other things, Brahman or Tao or whatever. Eckhart Tolle calls it being. There's all sorts. I think, who is it? Paul Lowe just refers to the source, that kind of thing. So it's just sort of it's largely a cultural difference with a different kind of approach to essentially the same situation. So Lucky Luciano's second question is, do you think the Tao could be real? And from a Buddhist point of view, the absolute, it's ultimately real, but then you can't really say anything about it. So even to say that it's real is invalid. To say that it isn't real is invalid. To say that it is and isn't real is invalid. To say that it neither is nor isn't real is invalid. Anything you can say about it is invalid, so you're better off just not talking about it. That's like the ancient Buddhist approach. So you can say that the Tao is real. You say that the ultimate, the absolute is real, the highest truth, ultimate reality. Yeah, ultimate reality, I mean, that would have to be real in a sense, but the concept of real is very different from actual reality. And when you're just dealing with intellectual concepts and words and so forth, you're better off just, I mean, for some people it's helpful, I guess. I mean, most spiritual traditions do reify the absolute and call it by some name. Even the Buddhists have to call it Nibbana or Nibbana Dhatu, or some Mahayana Buddhists will talk about the Dharmakaya or the one mind or whatever. So, I mean, in order to even talk about something, you have to give it a name. And so long as the Tao is like ultimate reality, then by definition, ultimate reality would have to be ultimately real. But there's different approaches. So I'll just move on to Lucky Luciano's third question, which is, do you think the Tao and the Greek logos are pretty much the same concept, just explained a little differently by two different cultures. And the logos, I mean, the Greeks in general tended to be rationalists. They were just in love with rational thinking. And even the name logos, I mean, literally means word, like in the New Testament where it says, you know, the God, when Jesus is called the Word, that really the original Greek is logos. Jesus is the logos. And that was sort of considered to be like the creative force. So the Tao is behind the creative force. So it'd be more like what Plotinus was calling the good. You know, it was like the Tao would come closer to like the ultimate in the philosophy of the Neoplatonists, like Plotinus especially. The Greek logos would be like a step down. It would be more like practically like the demiurge or something. You know, it's like the like Maya in like Mahayana Buddhism. No, not Mahayana Buddhism, but Hinduism. You know, you've got Brahma, who is the personification of ultimate reality. His consort is Maya, who is the one who is like giving birth to the entire universe. And I think the Tao would be more like Brahma or Brahman. And logos, I mean, I'm no authority on ancient Greek metaphysics of this nature, like Gnosticism or even Neoplatonism. You know, I never read all the way through like Plotinus. So, I mean, I'm no authority on this kind of ancient Greek attempts at mysticism. But logos, it is my understanding, I could be mistaken, but it is my understanding that logos was more of a phenomenal, you know, sort of what is creating the universe of multiplicity and not like the underlying unity that in a way gives rise to the multiplicity. It was more of, you know, it was like a step, at least one step away from the ultimate. So, I guess I answered that one about as well as I am able. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question and look at the clock, and it's a little less than 2 hours. Okay. This next question is from 8 Precept Erewhon. And 8 Precept Erewhon says, would intending to ordain for a higher rebirth hinder the monastic path, even if the intention is later purified with practice? Well, it would be kind of a hindrance at the beginning, but I mean, you're going to have unenlightened reasons to begin the monastic path. Otherwise, I mean, you wouldn't need to take the monastic path because you'd already be enlightened. And this, the classic example of this is the Buddha kind of played a dirty trick, and he had a half brother named Nanda, not Ananda, his chief, his attendant, but just Nanda. That was the Buddha's half brother. And on Nanda's wedding day, the Buddha showed him a glimpse of heaven, like Tawatimsa heaven, and what the celestial nymphs, like the goddesses, look like up there. And compared with them, the woman that Nanda was going to marry, this mere human mortal, you know, looked like a burnt monkey by comparison. And so the Buddha played a kind of dirty trick on Nanda to get him to renounce the world and essentially jilt his fiancée on their wedding day. And so Nanda became a monk, wanting to get at those celestial nymphs and wanting to get at those goddess hotties in heaven. But as he practiced, you know, he was using kind of a bad reason for practicing to begin with, but any reason to practice is better than just not practicing. And then he was practicing correctly, you know, under the guidance of the Buddha himself. And so he was making like development in wisdom, so that as he got wiser and wiser, his motivations got wiser and wiser, and he eventually became enlightened. And then, of course, he didn't want the hotties in heaven anymore. So you can start off with a foolish reason, and just about any reason to start the monastic path is going to be a delusional, to some degree, foolish reason, because you're unenlightened. It's going to be an unenlightened reason. And then if you practice, even though, I mean, that dumb reason is still going to be inspiring you to practice. And so long as you're practicing correctly, then your wisdom will improve, and then you'll come up with better reasons. So, I mean, anything that causes you to practice Dhamma is, it's sort of like skillful means. In Mahayana, they talk about skillful means. It's so long as it gets you going, then it's not all bad. It could be an unenlightened reason, but it's getting you to practice. And then when you practice, you get wiser and your reasons get better. So in a way, it's kind of a hindrance, just because your whole mental state when you're unenlightened is just to some degree a hindrance. But it's better than not entering the monastic path at all, if that is really what your calling is. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from La Infamia. And La Infamia says, is God in an Abrahamic or Vedic way a theory? And so long as you've got names and labels and so forth, it's all theoretical. Like God in the Abrahamic sense, we can get to the Vedic sense next, I suppose, but God in an Abrahamic sense, I mean, yeah, that would have to be theoretical. I mean, humans trying to understand God and then coming up with like a wrathful, vengeful God who developed over time. I mean, originally the God of the Hebrews was El. It was just like a Canaanite God, a father figure, who then later got conflated with an Edomite or Midianite war god and god of storms called Yahweh. They got conflated. Maybe some Egyptian influences helped in the development of God also. And I mean, in a way it was a theory, although of course monotheists who believe in the Abrahamic God would not consider it to be a theory. They just consider it to be a fact. But it's just, I mean, how could it not be a theory when you've got mere humans trying to come up with ideas about a being that is infinitely beyond them? It's like amoebas trying to understand a human. It's not going to happen, at least not in that way. You can, if God becomes just like this formless underlying, this practically emptiness, it's just infinite formless consciousness or some such, then you can understand that, but not intellectually. You just have to like blend in with it. You just have to become aware of it by getting rid of all the distractions that are preventing you from just being aware of it directly. But God in an Abrahamic sense is the wrathful, vengeful, the angry old man with the long beard sitting on the throne in heaven with angels fluttering around his feet like butterflies. That would be like the Old Testament kind of God. So, I mean, even that developed over time, so that like in seminary schools, like Catholic seminaries, they're teaching like a very abstract kind of God that's getting very close to like what the Upanishads are teaching. So, yeah, getting to the Upanishads or just the Vedic God. I mean, Vedic God wouldn't be a capital G God. If you're talking about like the Rig Veda, that was like polytheistic. There may be some later texts, later hymns in the Rig Veda that are hinting at monotheism or one ultimate highest God. But instead, it's like, I think like Vedic proto-Hinduism was called something like henotheism, where it's like, each god, or there's several different gods that are all praised as being the highest God, because in a way they're sort of like representations of the highest God. And you can have more than one representation of the highest God or some such. But I'm not exactly sure what a capital G God in a Vedic sense would be, unless it's a Vedantist sense of Brahman as just infinite formless consciousness. And so long as you're thinking about it intellectually, it's a theory. If you're in a mystical state experiencing it directly, then it's not a theory. But so long as you're thinking, so long as you're thinking about it, you're trying to figure it out, then it's going to be a theory. So I think I answered that. And so I'm going to move on to La Infamia's second question, which is, does early Buddhism reward dying in battle? Like creating extra amount of positive karma. The only way you would get good karma from dying in battle or being on a battlefield to begin with would be like if you were like a pacifistic stretcher bearer. You're just an unarmed person, like taking wounded soldiers off the battlefield so they could get medical attention. And then you get killed doing that. You know, like Mahatma Gandhi did that during World War One. He was like a stretcher bearer on battlefields. He was unarmed. He was a pacifist, but he was doing his patriotic duty for the empire by, helping getting wounded soldiers off the battlefield so they could get medical attention. So something like that would be okay. But fighting as a soldier in early Buddhism, definitely a no-no. Like monks are forbidden even to set foot on a battlefield. You're not allowed to even go and look at soldiers like in formation, like a military parade, anything like that. Monks aren't allowed to even go look at that. I mean, obviously, Buddhism was radical pacifism. You're not even allowed to step on bugs. Not on purpose, anyway. You step on them accidentally, then that's fine. But you step on, to kill any living being on purpose. Any macroscopic being. I think bacteria are fair game. Protozoans, I suppose, are fair game. So, yeah, Buddhism does not reward dying in battle. You're not guaranteed of heaven or any such thing if you die on a battlefield. There is some military metaphors, like poetic language. Like there's a sutta in the Sutta Nipata where before the Buddha became enlightened, he's striving for enlightenment, and Mara, the evil one, is trying to talk him out of it. And the Bodhisattva, the soon-to-be Buddha, says it's better to die in battle than to live in defeat. But he's talking about spiritual, sort of figurative spiritual battle and not actually standing on a battlefield killing people. So yeah, emphatically not in that case. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. But I will say that like Zen Buddhists, there have been like samurai sword masters that were apparently Zen masters. There was like an unofficial extra koan added to the Mumonkan by some samurai sword master who added another koan to the Mumonkan, which is a collection of Zen koans. And apparently he was highly respected with regard to his wisdom, even though he probably like hacked people to death with swords. But he did it in accordance with Bushido and, like the Zen detachment and just doing it all for honor and not for, like as a thrill sport or, aggression or anything like that. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. Have another slug of cold coffee. And Rui says, would you say that upekkha is what creates an enduring rift between dukkha and tanha until final deliverance is achieved? Would you also agree that it consists of an enduring non-verbal state, i.e. without mental formations, in which awareness is nevertheless still present? So upekkha is the highest of the four Brahma Viharas, and it is considered to be the highest of the four Brahma Viharas. It's the only Brahma Vihara that leads all the way to fourth jhana. So it is the mental state that can get you the highest of the four Brahma Viharas anyway. So let's see, there's two questions here, I guess. So I might as well separate the two questions. And maybe I'll answer the second one first because I think it's easier. Would you also agree that it consists of an enduring nonverbal state without mental formations in which awareness is nevertheless still present? If you want to call just pure consciousness or, like, for example, fourth jhana, like the highest state of contemplation. Yeah, there would be upekkha in that. So, you could call it that. Just kind of by default, it's not like upekkha would be a discrete mental state, like one of the 52 ultimately real mental states as described in Abhidhamma, it would just be sort of a lack of agitated mental states or attached mental states. So that an enlightened mind would be an equanimous mind. So that there would always be upekkha and an enlightened mind. And it would be nonverbal, I suppose. Although, I mean, you could have upekkha while thinking thoughts, but the upekkha could still be there. So it wouldn't be, I mean, the verbality, is that a word? The verbosity, the symbolic states of words would not be really an aspect of upekkha, but they could exist at the same time. So, yeah, I mean, you'd have to have awareness with upekkha. So, see, would you agree that it consists of an enduring nonverbal state without mental formations in which awareness is nevertheless still present? Yeah, I mean, you could have upekkha with mental formations and with words in thoughts, but that wouldn't be the upekkha. They could coexist. It's just that they would not be the upekkha. I mean, they could be suffused with upekkha, I suppose, because upekkha really isn't a discrete mental state so much as it's like an absence of non-equanimous mental states, seems to me. But you'd still have to have consciousness. So pure upekkha would be like fourth jhana. So getting up to the first part of this question, would you say that upekkha is what creates an enduring rift between dukkha and tanha, which is like unease and craving, until final deliverance is achieved? Well, the dukkha, yeah, I think the rift would have to be before you even get to the dukkha, unless it's just physical dukkha. If it's physical pain, then you can have like detachment from that, like equanimity towards that. But the mental dukkha, the unhappiness aspect of dukkha, I mean, you've already failed at equanimity if you're experiencing that, unless maybe you've just sort of denatured it through mindfulness. You know, you're detached from it, and then it could still be just nature running its course. But then it gets really difficult to explain that sort of thing. So would I say that upekkha is what creates an enduring rift between dukkha and tanha, or between perception and craving? Yeah, it might be better to have the rift between perception and tanha, like sanya and tanha. Or in the 12 nidana theory, I think it's vedana and tanha. So that would be where you cut the chain, is between like feeling and suffering. So would I say that upekkha is what creates an enduring rift until final deliverance is achieved? I mean, you could say that. I mean, there's other words like nibbida. You know, there's like the kind of trilogy in Buddhist spiritual development. You start off with nibbida, which is like disenchantment or sort of disillusionment, which leads to viraga, which is dispassion, which comes closer to equanimity. And this dispassion leads to vimutti or vimokha, which is liberation. So nibbida leads to viraga, which leads to vimokha. So I guess nibbida, just being fed up with samsara, that wouldn't be pure upekkha. But then the next stage is viraga, which is dispassion. So that might be like upekkha, and then that would be upekkha, and which then leads to liberation or vimokha. So yeah, I mean, you could argue that way. I mean, there's different ways of interpreting things, I suppose, but that's one relatively valid way of interpreting it. I wouldn't say that upekkha is necessarily enduring, especially at first. But when you become fully enlightened, I assume upekkha would always be there. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from RPAD. And RPAD says, did you break your monastic vows before or after disrobing? And this is based on the misconception that Theravada Buddhist monks take monastic vows. I mean, there are no real vows that monastic Theravada Buddhist monks take. You've got rules of discipline. You know, you've got, training rules. And I mean, all monks break those. I mean, there's different levels. You know, it's like 7 different categories of monastic offenses. You know, you start off with dukkha and dubasita, which you just make confession and it's over. Then above that is padidesaniya, which you make confession and it's gone. Then is pachitya and nisagiya pachitya. And then above that is you're starting to get into, I mean, all of these you can just disappear. They just disappear. The offense anyway disappears through confession. Then you've got tulachaya, which is like a grave offense, which would include something like eating human flesh. And that one also, I mean, you can just confess it and it sort of absolves you of the ecclesiastical offense. It doesn't absolve you of any bad karma you made. And then above that is sanghadisesa. There's 13 of those, and those you have to do penance for 6 days and 6 nights, and then go through a relatively elaborate reinstatement ceremony, which is really a pain in the butt. I did it a few times, mainly just to get rid of doubts in my mind. Did I do that on purpose or was it an accident? You know, you got to like psychoanalyze yourself. You can't be sure whether you really did break the rule or not. So you just do the penance just to kind of wipe the slate clean. And then finally, you've got the 4 parajikas, where if you break any of these 4 parajika rules, you're excommunicated from the Sangha for the rest of your life. And that's having sex, stealing anything that's valuable enough that you can get arrested for it, essentially. Murder, killing another human being or talking another human being into killing themselves or whatever. And then finally is deliberately lying about having attained superhuman mental states. And I did not excommunicate myself. Everybody breaks rules, but I didn't break any of the rules that would excommunicate me. And so I deliberately disrobed. And then I did kind of commit a parajika offense, which would be the first one, after I wasn't a monk anymore. So with regard to this question, did you break your monastic vows before or after disrobing? There are no monastic vows. You know, it's not like a Catholic who takes the vows of, poverty, chastity, and obedience. I mean, that's a Christian thing. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Connor. And Connor says, if we go by the idea that this infinite unconditioned consciousness is God or Brahma, how does Buddhism differentiate itself from Hinduism and other mystical schools of thought? The main way Buddhism differentiates itself, I mean, superficially, is just the term used. But at a deeper level, Buddhism, as a general rule, does not reify the absolute. You know, it just doesn't even go there. The Buddha taught, I mean, one of the main teachings of early Buddhism, you cannot understand reality by thinking about it. You cannot figure out ultimate truth. And so you don't even go there. I mean, it's like actual mysticism. You just attain it directly without like figuring it out, because you can't figure it out. And so in a way, it doesn't reify the absolute, because if you reify the absolute, you've taken the highest truth and just turn it into a symbol. And then people start confusing the symbol with what it's supposed to represent, which is what a lot of Christians do with God, for example. They've got their idea about what God is like. And that's just infinitely different from what God is really like, because you cannot contain God in some relatively crude human symbolic thoughts and ideas. So, I mean, Buddhism, I think, wisely just acknowledged that, I mean, you can't understand it by thinking about it. You're just going to pervert it into something that it isn't by theorizing about it and talking about it. And so the Buddha pretty much just described Nibbana as what it isn't. It's not this, it's not that, it's not the other thing, and did not really try to explain what it's like, because you just can't explain what it's like. So generally in human language, you either have to say something exists or something doesn't exist. And the ultimate, I mean, it's just a dichotomy, a symbolic dichotomy, and it's none of it is really valid. Exists is invalid, doesn't exist is invalid, does and doesn't exist is invalid, neither does nor doesn't exist is invalid. And so, nevertheless, as human beings, we have to use some kind of language. And so generally, we have to choose one of the false dichotomy of is or isn't. And most religions, most spiritual systems, including Buddhism, choose is. I mean, including Hinduism and some Mahayana Buddhism, choose is. Whereas early Buddhism, it didn't even go there, but then Theravada was more inclined to adopt the position of isn't. And so, in a way, it's safer, but it's less satisfying emotionally to people who want to know that they're on the right track and they're believing the right theories and dogmas and all that. So it's like a human weakness that most people will gravitate towards is and call it God or Tao or Brahman or the Dharmakaya or the one mind or whatever. Whereas really just not even going there is the wisest approach. And you just feel it through dark faith, what St. John on the Cross called dark faith. You can't even talk about it. I don't even know why I'm trying to talk about this. So, that's the main differentiation with regard to the ultimate, how Buddhism differentiates itself from Hinduism and other mystical schools of thought, is that Buddhism is less inclined to try to reify the absolute, to symbolize the absolute, to try to explain the highest truth, because the Buddha realized that you cannot explain it, you cannot figure it out, you cannot know it perceptually. And the Hindus, like the more advanced Hindus, kind of know that too, but still they have to use it as a kind of a gimmick or a makeshift, calling it words and saying stuff about it, even though it's all ultimately invalid. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cleefy. And Cleefy says he's got questions. And at the end of his first question, there's these 3 dots that don't cut and paste. But no matter how many times I refresh the page, there's only this one question. It may be that Cleefy asked more than one question, but no matter how many times I refresh that page, I would only get this one question. And this one question is, how to avoid that a personal practice wouldn't become an escapism that in its turn becomes a spiritual pride. Well, how to avoid that a personal practice wouldn't become an escapism that in its turn becomes a spiritual pride. Well, the way to avoid the spiritual pride is through mindfulness. To some degree, if you're not wise enough to catch it, you've got delusion still, then you can't be aware of your delusion, because to the extent that you're aware of it, it's not delusion anymore. But spiritual pride, when that arises, you can be mindful of that, and that can help you to cure yourself of it, to detach yourself from it. But with regard to a personal practice, how to avoid that it won't become an escapism, I'm not exactly sure. It would depend on your motivations, I think. If your motivation is to understand reality and to be more awake, more conscious, then other people can say that you're practicing escapism by just sitting there, like watching your breath or whatever. But really, they're more escapists than you are. The person that sits there just watching his breath for an hour straight is less of an escapist than the person who is like doom scrolling on X or whatever it is. Most of the stuff that we do is just a way of like escaping from just the burden of existence in a way. We're trying to escape from just the discomfort, the dukkha of the First Noble Truth of just being alive. And so we try to distract ourselves by, getting interested in this and forgetting the outside world. Whereas the person who's meditating is actually trying to get closer to reality. It's less of a distraction than doom scrolling on X. If you're sitting there just watching or like perceiving the sensation of touch at the nostrils when you're breathing. So how to avoid that a personal practice wouldn't become an escapism? You just have to have like right intention for that one, and just have enough wisdom to know when you're getting closer to reality than when you're getting farther away from it. And don't bother with other people's definitions of escapism. You know, an escape from reality. You know, my father used to say drugs are an escape from reality, but some drugs will take you closer to reality if you're not careful. And then the next stage is how to avoid that personal practice won't become spiritual pride or result in spiritual pride. And that's just mindfulness. You've got to like observe yourself and know what your own motives are and so forth. And so I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Kundru. And Kundru says, what is your favorite non-spiritual book of all time? And that's a difficult one because as a general rule, books that I like have to have some kind of like link to spirituality. So any kind of novel, I mean, there's always spirituality to be found in novels. Moby Dick, very spiritual book. Dostoevsky's The Idiot, very spiritual book. Anything written by Dostoevsky, practically any of his great novels have spiritual basis to them, or like a strong spiritual theme. Like Battle for the Mind by William Sargent that I've mentioned several times. I mean, that applies to spirituality. So the one book that I can think of that is one of my favorites that is not spiritual, you know, I'll get it. Just a minute. Stay right there. I'll be right back. Let's see, where is it? Oh boy, I should have gotten it out here. Oh, here it is. Okay. I found this at a used bookstore in Mandalay in Burma when I was a monk. Strategy, the Indirect Approach by B.H. Liddell Hart. And this B.H. Liddell Hart, he was writing, he was a military strategist. He was like the military editor for the Encyclopedia Britannica for a while. And he used to write in military journals. And one of the things he was writing about before World War II was the possibility of a tank invasion through the Ardennes. And the British and the Americans just kind of ignored him, but the Germans were carefully studying what this guy was writing. And he was, without trying to, he was like one of the main teachers of tank strategy for the Germans in World War II. They studied this guy intensively because like tank warfare was a new thing. You know, it was just getting developed in World War II. And he was the guy that was trying to come up with strategies because, you know, it was like this new kind of warfare. And so you had to have new kinds of strategies. And so he was comparing tank warfare now to like heavily armored cavalry, like the cataphracts, you know, the knights in armor, just heavy like plate armor of like the ancient and Middle Ages. So anyways, I mean, there is some spirituality in this too. Like in the introduction, he's talking about how strategy, the indirect approach, is a full-on offensive is just the most foolish way of fighting. Like with regard to the military, but also with regard to just like winning an argument, getting your point across, just like a full-on frontal offensive is like the worst way of going about it. And so in the introduction, he's talking about how it is like pretty much the duty of a prophet to just tell the flat out unvarnished truth, and then prophets get martyred. You know, like the prophet is not a diplomat. He's just telling it as it is, just flat out and offending everybody. And so he winds up getting killed. And then another person comes along who's more diplomatic, who then can teach what the prophet was teaching, except kind of doctor it up and put it in more indirect terms or some such so that it's more acceptable. And then a new religion can get started from that. But as a general rule, this book, which is well worth reading, by the way, it's it's mainly like a strategic play-by-play of some of the most important battles and wars in history, some of the most influential or consequential battles and wars. You know, he's pointing out, he's got this thesis that the greatest victories come from the indirect approach. Like he talks about William T. Sherman in the Civil War. And that one of the reasons why Sherman was so devastating in his tactics is that he would like march his men like in between two main objectives, two main cities, so that the defenders didn't know which city he was going to go for until right at the end. So they would either have to defend both cities, which divides their forces in half, or they would have to put most of their forces in one city, and then Sherman would just go and attack the other city. So it's like you don't use force against force, you use force against weakness. You attack, it could even be like a secondary target or something, but if it's undefended, you just go for it. And I mean, it's like he quotes Sun Tzu at the beginning in like these little quotes. It's like, it's like the secret of successful strategy is when you're near, let your enemy think that you're far away. When you're far away, let your enemy think that you are near. When you are many, make your enemy think that you are few. When you are few, make your enemy think that you are many. When you're ready to fight, make your enemy think that you are not ready to fight. And when you're not ready to fight, make your enemy think that you are ready. And it's just deception and counterfuge and just using strength against weakness instead of strength against strength, that sort of thing. And I mean, it can apply to all sorts of things, like I was talking about. He does make this token little reference to spirituality at the beginning, but mostly it's like a synopsis of what makes the most successful strategies. And it's the indirect approach. Where, I mean, ideally, you defeat your enemy before the battle has even started. You just ruin their morale. You cut off their communications. You cut off their food supply. Just let them sit and get hungry and demoralized, and then you attack. That kind of thing. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Fred. And Fred says, given that everything in the cosmos has cause and effect, it follows Nibbana is outside the cosmos, in my opinion. Therefore, it cannot be experienced by prana. What's your idea on this? And yeah, this is another person that seems to be a theme in this Q&A. There was one sort of a question that I'm not going to answer, that it wasn't really set up as a question for this Q&A, that's talking about how Nibbana cannot be experienced. You can't really experience it, because in order to experience something in accordance with Theravada Buddhism anyway, you have to perceive it, and you cannot perceive Nibbana, because a perception is just a symbol. Nibbana is not a symbol. So if you symbolize it, you're not dealing with Nibbana anymore. You're just dealing with this symbol that's called Nibbana. So Nibbana is outside the cosmos. Yeah, it's outside of samsara anyway. Or at least it's maybe not outside of samsara, but it's just at a whole different level than samsara. And so it cannot be experienced by prana. Yeah, I mean, you can't perceive it anyway. The unenlightened mind cannot perceive or understand Nibbana. But again, Nibbana is underlying everything in a sense. You can, if you want to reify Nibbana, anything you say about Nibbana is going to be invalid. But you can say, this is a cup or this is porcelain. And it's ceramic. Let's call it ceramic. Maybe it's not real porcelain. I don't know. But it's ceramic. So, I mean, it's ceramic and it's a cup at the same time. But ceramic and cup do not mean the same thing. They are not synonyms. So it's the form is cup, but the essence is ceramic. And that's kind of the way you can look at Nibbana and samsara. Nibbana is the underlying essence. Samsara is the superficial forms. But again, you're reifying Nibbana. It's completely beyond duality. Neither is nor isn't applies to it. And so it's just a fool's errand trying to explain it. And I'm just going to have another drink of this cold coffee. So, yeah, you can't really perceive it, because once you symbolize it, that's not it anymore. Then it becomes form. It becomes superficial form. because a symbol is a form. So I'm just going to move on to Fred's second question, which is, you never answered my robot question. I think it's possible a robot can be self-aware. Yeah, Fred, he asks questions. Sometimes I'm not sure if he's really asking the question or not. Sometimes I think it's like a rhetorical question. This time I thought maybe he was joking, but he's talking about somehow the idea of like AI becoming self-aware was discussed. And so he was saying, if a robot looks into a mirror, can it have self-awareness? And I thought the way he asked it, I thought maybe he was joking or just kind of asking a kind of rhetorical, kind of semi-jokey question. But I guess he was serious. It's hard to tell sometimes with Fred, because sometimes he'll just put question marks at the end of comments, just kind of the way some people, when they talk, they end it like they're asking a question, and it's sometimes it confuses me. So, I mean, if a robot looks into a mirror, can it have self-awareness that way? I mean, there's different ways you could do that. You could just program the robot to acknowledge its own reflection in a mirror, in which case it might not be conscious at all. It's just acting in accordance with its programming. So that wouldn't be exactly the same as self-awareness. It would have to actually be aware, to have like a mental image in its mind and like see its reflection in the mirror and recognize that is its own reflection. And I think it's possible. I don't see why it would be necessarily impossible that you could have a sentient robot that would be able to recognize itself consciously in a mirror, not just, like being programmed to acknowledge that is its reflection without it being sentient. That would be different. But I don't see why not. So an Abhidhamma scholar I spoke to, a Burmese Abhidhamma scholar, told me that like a computer can never possibly be conscious because consciousness requires kamaja rupa, which is like matter that is generated by karma, and a computer wouldn't have that. But I think he was just being dogmatic and just repeating what the book said. And when those things were composed, there were no computers. So I think I'm just going to move on to Fred's next question. Have you seen the Swedish television show Humans? Also, the British did one along the same lines. No, I can't recall ever seeing a Swedish television show, and I watch very few television shows at all. I don't watch very many like American television shows, although we do have Discovery Plus, and it has become a tradition that my woman and I will watch some kind of paranormal ghost investigating show before we go to sleep, and we can watch the same one many times because we generally fall asleep before we get halfway through it lately. So yeah, like there's one called Portals to Hell with Ozzy Osbourne's son Jack Osbourne and a woman named Katrina Weidman or Weidman. Some of it's pretty trippy. Some of these haunted houses, haunted places they go to, it's some really trippy stuff goes on. Anyways, yeah, with regard to Swedish television shows, no, I haven't seen any Swedish television shows by any name whatsoever. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is the last question. I always get taken by surprise. The last question of the Q&A is from Extremely Rare Bird. An extremely rare bird says, Earth's wildlife populations have reportedly declined by an average of 69% in only 50 years. Primarily, this decline is due to the loss and fragmentation of the animals' habitats driven by our global agricultural system. Leaders like Trump do not seem to care about the climate or global warming, and even tries to make things worse. In his first term, more than 125 environmental rules and policies were rolled back. And then there's the rest of the world, countries that don't even have any environmental policies and keep chugging along as usual. So the prospects for the future are looking bad. What are your thoughts on this issue? Yeah, well, I think we are in the middle of an extinction event, which began a long time ago. Like most of the megafauna on this planet has already been killed off everywhere except for like Africa. Like all of the megafauna, the really big animals, got killed off in Australia, coincidentally, shortly after humans arrived there. And it was probably human predation that like drove the woolly mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses to extinction, like the really big animals. I mean, that was one of the main reasons why they became extinct, is people killed them off. And so I can't remember what it's called, the Quaternary or the Holocene. I can't remember, whatever era or epoch we are in now, it's called that extinction event. And there have been many extinction events on this planet. I mean, whenever there's an ice age, whenever there's a major glaciation, most of the animals go extinct. Most of the animals get killed off, at least on land. It's not so big of a deal in the ocean, except for everything cools down a lot. And so, you know, fish and other kinds of animals that require warmer water may go extinct. But I mean, we have had extinction event after extinction event after extinction event on this planet. And generally it has been caused by like comet impacts, meteor impacts, or like volcanic activity. There was one major extinction event. I can't remember exactly which one it was. It was a major one where apparently this huge coal field in like Siberia caught fire and just pumped just billions of tons of carbon into the atmosphere, which caused some kind of extinction event. I think there was so much carbon dioxide in the air that in the ocean, at least, there was so much carbon dioxide getting absorbed into the ocean. It caused carbonic acid, which dissolved the shells of all the life forms that had calcium carbonate shells. And then anything that fed on them also became extinct. And it just caused, you know, there have been times when most of the life forms, most of the species have just been killed off. And we are in the midst of one of those. And it's not nearly as bad as some of them have been. There's like different strands here. I think with regard to humans, it's just inevitable that we're going to go through some kind of extinction event. I mean, not us ourselves necessarily going to become extinct unless there's like AI takes over, sees us as a pest that's in the way, or, you know, some massive thermonuclear explosion. But even if there's like a thermonuclear Armageddon, there's going to be at least some elites in special underground bunkers with, you know, nuclear energy and hydroponics and stuff. There's going to be small populations of humans that are going to survive even that, probably. So with regard to global warming and the climate, I am somewhat skeptical of that. And partly it's like the globalist establishment. It is to their advantage that everyone believe that global warming is this incipient disaster, unless all of a sudden we have like international regulatory commissions like governing stuff that, of course, is like setting the stage for globalism in general. But again, it's like, why is it that an increase in carbon dioxide, which is going to warm the earth to some degree, why is it necessarily a bad thing? I mean, the earth has been much warmer than it is now. And I mean, it wasn't a disaster. I mean, if things change too fast, then certain species won't be able to evolve fast enough. They'll die out. It will, you know, contribute to the anthropogenic extinction event that we've been in for thousands of years. But I mean, I have heard that there's more vegetation covering the earth now than there was 20 years ago, because carbon dioxide is a kind of fertilizer. And that one reason why more people aren't starving right now is because the increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere causes crops to grow better. So, I mean, there's like an upside and a downside to everything. And for some reason, the establishment is emphasizing the downside, even maybe exaggerating it to some degree, and just ignoring the upside. So I think there was some commission, or I don't know if you call it a commission. It was a group of people at Oxford University, all kinds of experts, and they were trying to figure out what to do about global warming or climate change or whatever it's called now. And they were saying the best thing we can do is just be flexible, because we're not going to be able to stop it. Even if America and Western Europe just cracked down on environmentalism, went completely green, China and India are still going to be spewing out carbon dioxide. They don't care. China especially. So China is emitting more carbon. China and India are emitting more carbon dioxide than all the rest of the world combined. And they don't have to follow the accords or anything. You know, they'll say, well, 20 years, 30 years down the line, then we can do that. So I think the best thing, the most realistic approach we can take is just be flexible, as flexible as we can manage. I do not think that the Earth is going to become Tatooine, some sort of desert planet. In the past, when the temperature has risen, what has happened is it increases evaporation from the ocean, which increases cloud cover, which increases rainfall. And instead of a desert, you get the world is more jungly, like when the dinosaurs were walking around. I mean, there were dinosaurs at the South Pole or in Antarctica anyway, because it was warm enough, the Earth was warm enough that you could have dinosaurs even like in the Arctic and Antarctic. So why it is that it's going to be a desert that's just going to kill everybody, I'm not sure about that. And of course, then you've got like counter theories that most of the global warming isn't necessarily anthropogenic. You know, there's like variations in the radiation output of the sun and that sort of thing that some people are thinking is doing more of it than we humans are. So let's see, what is the question here? Let's see. Earth's wildlife populations have reportedly declined by an average of 69% in only 50 years. Yeah, well, when the meteor smacked into what is now the Gulf of Mexico like 63 million years ago, it was like the wildlife populations declined by an average of like 90% in only like 5 years. And primarily, this decline is due to the loss and fragmentation of the animals' habitats driven by our global agricultural system. Yeah, that is true. And it may be that I've been told that what is happening in recent years is that more and more people are getting more and more concentrated in the cities, so that in a way you've got it's not as destructive as if the human population was just like distributed evenly all over the earth. But I mean, there are places that should be protected, like the Amazon rainforest, some of the big rainforests in like Borneo, which are just being chopped down by people that value money more than they value some abstract ecological disaster that may happen decades in the future. Like, I lived in Asia for many years. The Burmese, they have no compassion or sympathy with nature. Nature is just scary. They don't like it. You know, they're people oriented, and a tree is there was one monastery attendant that would not stop chopping down trees at the monastery. I eventually just threw him out and wouldn't let him come back. But I'd come down there, he's chopping down trees. Why are you chopping down the trees? And you say, oh, this tree is no good. It doesn't have fruit on it or anything. It's not a valuable tree. And it's like, you just don't get it. I mean, they just do not appreciate nature or nature conservation. I've seen Burmese guy chop down a tree just to pick some leaves out of the tree for making betel quids or something, wrapping cigars or something. Just chop down the whole tree just to get some leaves, a handful of leaves. So, yeah, I mean, the realistic thing to do is we just have to be flexible with whatever mess we create. We're going to have to figure out some way of surviving it. Let's see here. Leaders like Trump do not seem to care about the climate or global warming, and even tries to make things worse. In his first term, more than 125 environmental rules and policies were rolled back. Yes, Elon Musk was talking about that before he could it was some kind of, he was going to land a rocket in the ocean. And then it was like the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NOAA, required him to do a study on what were the odds of a a spacecraft landing in the ocean hitting a shark. And so he had to do that study. And then they had, what are the odds of a spacecraft landing in the ocean hitting a whale? And it's a lot of these environmental rules and policies are just like bloated bureaucracy that should be rolled back. With regard to conservation and so forth, yeah, I mean, I do agree. I'm all in favor of like wildlife refuges, preserves, national parks, that sort of thing, definitely. And there should be more of them. In fact, I think it'd be good if like most of the Amazon rainforest, which is dwindling rapidly, were conserved. And it's kind of unrealistic to hope that like Borneo won't just all get turned into, what is it, like those oil palm plantations. Yeah, we are kind of making a mess of the world, but it's just not realistic that we're going to be able to stop. Because even if the West stops, the East isn't going to stop. So, let's see here. And then there's the rest of the world, countries that don't even have any environmental policies and keep chugging along as usual. So the prospects for the future are looking bad. What are your thoughts on the issue? Yeah, I guess I've already said it. It's just we have to be flexible and adapt to whatever kind of mess we create. And I mean, it's going to be a matter of karma from a Buddhist point of view. You know, we're going to live in the world that our karma like has destined us to live in. So I really don't think that we're going to destroy the earth, and things are going to get warmer, and that's going to have some positive aspects and some negative aspects. And just to emphasize the negative and ignore the positive, or even punish people who come up with the positive stuff. Like, I mean, the whole establishment, they'll punish scientists that don't toe the line. Like there was some Australian scientist who pointed out that the Great Barrier Reef was actually getting better. It wasn't global warming or carbon dioxide that was killing off parts of the Great Barrier Reef at one time, but it was just sort of a natural cycle that it goes through. And then it was starting to get better. He pointed this out. He lost his job because it goes against the narrative. So a lot of this, it's like fear mongering. I mean, anyone who watched like most of the mainstream media before Trump was elected president of the USA could see just the blatant hysterical fear mongering that they were using as propaganda to get people to do what the globalist establishment wanted them to do. And it's rather naive to think that the globalist establishment is using fear mongering about global warming to get us to do something that's good for the earth rather than good for the globalist establishment. They're thinking about themselves. And I just had this thought. It was a really good thought. It caught me in mid-sentence. Now I can't remember what it was, which is too bad. It was really a salient point, I must say. So we're just going to have to rely on a certain amount of human common sense, and also just rely on the idea that these predictions of how the world was going to go to hell have been false thus far. You know, it's like, I think it was, what's his name? Gore, Al Gore, was saying that if we didn't change everything soon, by 2010 or some such, Manhattan was going to be underwater. It didn't happen. I mean, we're still technically in an ice age. So long as you've got standing glaciers on the earth, ice packs and so forth, we're still in an ice age. The earth is much cooler than it usually is at the present time. So I think we are contributing to, in some small way, to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is causing the earth to warm. But it's not all bad. It's good for the plants, and so the plants grow better. And just because the earth warms up a bit, I mean, some places are going to get more comfortable, even though other places are going to get less comfortable. There's going to probably be increase in rainfall in some places, decrease in rainfall in other places, and trying to keep the earth completely static without changing is just unrealistic. Like I mentioned earlier, there's going to be like fluctuations in like solar radiation and all sorts of things that are beyond our control anyway. So we just do the best we can and hope that any massive extinction event isn't going to happen anytime soon. I mean, the extinction event we're in now, was it the Holocene extinction event? I think that's what it's called. I mean, it's been going on for thousands of years. It may be accelerating now, but it's been going on for thousands of years already. And we're just going to have to trust in our karma that we're not going to have to all face a major extinction event that's going to just wipe out everything and make the earth an uninhabitable desert. And, I mean, probably things aren't as bad as the globalist establishment would keep saying. I mean, the thought that I was having is there are way more dangerous things in this world than global warming. There's still nukes. There's more nukes now, at least more countries that have nukes, including North Korea. Iran will probably get nukes soon. Pakistan has got nukes now. And so, like, thermonuclear war is still, like, more of a threat to us as human beings than climate change. Also, AI. Like, before Stephen Hawking died, he switched his main threat to the human race from nukes. I mean, that was his main thing for many years. And towards the end of his life, he switched over to AI. The AI is really our main threat right now. Nobody talks about nukes. It's like the mainstream media just forgot about nukes pretty much. They might mention that something like Iran is close to getting nukes, and Israel bombed their Iran's nuclear research centers and development centers. North Korea's got nukes. They may mention that, but it's nothing like the 1980s where you've got like famous people like Carl Sagan, going on these protest marches to government agencies about, nuclear winter is going to just, wipe out the earth and all this. I mean, that's still a bigger threat than climate change. And it's just the establishment doesn't want you to be afraid about that. They want you to be afraid about climate change because that serves their interests. I'm not saying that there is no danger at all from global warming, increased carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases and so forth, but it's just not realistic to assume that we're going to do shit to stop it, because even if the West did it and impoverished themselves in the process, much reduced the standard of living, China and India would still be just chugging away at it. So again, like that Oxford group, came to the conclusion, and just like they were saying, it's like the best thing we can do, the most realistic approach we can take is to be flexible and to adapt to the changes. And I think that's it. That's the last question. And I hope I've answered it, maybe not satisfactorily to a lot of people, but I did answer it. And so, as I always say at the end, which I should be saying at the beginning, if you have any questions that you think I can answer about early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, Buddhism in general, like Eastern philosophy or spirituality in general, monasticism in general, meditation, philosophy on Eastern or Western, myself personally, Burma, that kind of thing, feel free to ask. And if I can answer, I will try to do so. And just leave your question in the comments below. No more than 3 questions per episode, please. And be happy.